Hey there, wonderful viewers. If you're enjoying my content, please take a second to hit that like button. It really helps the YouTube algorithm show my videos to more people. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. Now grab your favorite drink, sit back, relax, and let's dive into today's story. I promise it'll be worth your time. I live near Blackridge National Park, a vast wilderness area covering more than 200,000 acres of dense forest, rocky ravines, and mist-covered mountains. The park draws thousands of tourists annually who come to hike its trails, camp beneath its ancient trees, and photograph its spectacular vistas. But those of us who have lived in its shadow our entire lives understand there's another side to Blackridge. For locals like myself, the park holds secrets that don't appear in glossy brochures or guided tour narratives. We've grown accustomed to reports of strange occurrences, unexplained sounds echoing through valleys at night, hikers experiencing lost time, and occasionally, people who enter the park and never return. Park rangers attribute most disappearances to exposure, accidents, or disorientation. Their explanations satisfy tourists and authorities, but longtime residents exchange knowing glances when another search party is organized. I've spent countless hours in Blackridge throughout my life, fishing its streams, hiking its most remote trails, and occasionally camping overnight in areas few visitors ever reach. Most of my experiences have been peaceful, even transcendent, but there have been moments, fleeting and unsettling, when something felt profoundly wrong. Times when the forest fell silent too suddenly, when shadows seemed to move independently of what cast them, when I felt watched by eyes I couldn't see. The incident I'm about to relate occurred in June 2019 when I was 10 years old. It remains the most terrifying experience of my life, one that fundamentally changed my relationship with the wilderness I once considered a second home. My grandmother, Eleanor, owned a century-old farmhouse situated on 40 acres of land that bordered the eastern edge of Blackridge. The property had been in our family for generations. Originally a working farm that had gradually returned to wilderness as farming became less viable in the region. Only about 5 acres around the house remained cleared. The rest had surrendered to forest, indistinguishable from the national park, except for property markers few people could locate. Reaching Grandmother Eleanor's house required navigating a winding, poorly maintained gravel road that ascended nearly 800 feet from the main highway. The road frequently washed out during heavy rains, making the property effectively unreachable without a vehicle equipped with four-wheel drive. This isolation was precisely why my grandmother refused to leave, despite her advancing age and increasingly fragile health. At the base of the hill, about a quarter-mile from the main road, sat a double-wide trailer where my Aunt Vivian lived with my 3 cousins, Ben, 14, Jeremy, 12, and Kayla, 11. I was the youngest at 10, which made me the default target whenever we played chase games. My cousins and I were close despite seeing each other only during summer breaks and occasional holidays. We shared the special bond of children who understood what it meant to grow up in the shadow of Blackridge. We had all heard the stories, witnessed the strange atmospheric changes that sometimes swept through the forest, and learned which areas of the property to avoid after sunset. The summer of 2019 was unusual because Grandmother Eleanor had been hospitalized with pneumonia. Aunt Vivian stayed with her at the regional hospital about 40 miles away, leaving us under the supervision of our older cousin Marcus, who was 22 and home from college for the summer. Marcus was the only older cousin we genuinely respected and trusted. He teased us mercilessly but always made sure we were safe and cared for. I arrived at the property on a Thursday afternoon, my mother dropping me off for what was supposed to be a 3-day visit. The weather forecast predicted clear skies, and I looked forward to spending time exploring with my cousins after being cooped up for most of the spring with a broken ankle. The first day passed uneventfully. We helped Marcus with chores around the property, clearing branches that had fallen during a recent storm, weeding Grandmother Eleanor's vegetable garden, and repairing a section of fence that kept deer from devouring her prized raspberry bushes. By late afternoon, our obligations fulfilled, we were free to play. We hiked down to the creek that ran through the property, spent hours catching crawfish and building small dams, then returned to the house sunburned and hungry. Marcus prepared a simple dinner of spaghetti and garlic bread, and we ate on the wide front porch, watching fireflies emerge as darkness slowly enveloped the forest. That night, Ben suggested we sleep in the old barn, a proposition that thrilled Kayla and Jeremy but made my stomach tighten with inexplicable dread. I reluctantly agreed, not wanting to appear cowardly in front of my older cousins. Marcus vetoed the plan, however, insisting we all sleep in the house where he could keep an eye on us. I felt an overwhelming sense of relief that I carefully concealed from the others. Looking back, I wonder if some part of me sensed what was coming, if the forest itself tried to warn me through the instinctive fear I felt at the prospect of sleeping outside that night. Friday began warm and clear. After breakfast, Marcus informed us he needed to drive into town for supplies. He gave strict instructions not to wander beyond the cleared portion of the property while he was gone, and especially not to venture toward the boundary with the national park. We obeyed, at least initially. We spent the morning playing board games on the porch and taking turns on the tire swing that hung from a massive oak tree in the front yard. But by early afternoon, restlessness set in. Ben suggested exploring the old root cellar beneath the barn, a forbidden zone due to its deteriorating stairs and low ceiling beams. The hours passed quickly as we excavated dusty jars of decades-old preserves and discovered a cache of antique farm tools. By the time we emerged, squinting in the sudden brightness, the sun had begun its descent toward the western ridge. Marcus had returned and called us in for an early dinner. As we ate, the easy conversation gradually shifted to the topic of night games. Ben proposed an elaborate version of hide-and-seek called wilderness survival, where one person would be designated the ranger while everyone else pretended to be lost hikers, trying to reach home base without being caught. The boundaries would extend to the property line, including the wooded areas we usually avoided after dark. Marcus hesitated but ultimately agreed on the condition that we all carry flashlights and stay within shouting distance of the house. No one goes near the park boundary, he insisted, his voice uncharacteristically serious. And everyone needs to be back at the house by 9:30, no exceptions. As dusk descended, we prepared for the game, gathering flashlights and establishing rules. We decided the first round would begin with Marcus as the ranger, giving us 5 minutes to hide before he started hunting. The home base would be the front porch, which we'd need to reach without being tagged. The game began and we scattered into the deepening shadows. I remember the excitement mingling with fear as I darted between trees, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly ahead of me. I found a hiding spot behind a rotting log about 200 yards from the house and switched off my light, waiting in the gathering darkness, heart pounding with exhilaration. Minutes passed. I heard distant calls as Marcus captured Jeremy, then Kayla's shriek of surprise as she too was found. I remained motionless, determined to win this round. Then came the sound of footsteps approaching my position, not the deliberate pace of someone searching, but the quick, confident stride of someone who knew exactly where I was hiding. I risked a glance over the log and saw a figure approximately where Marcus should have been, but something seemed off about the silhouette. The proportions weren't quite right. The shoulders appeared too broad, the stance too rigid. Still, in the dim light, I assumed it was him, especially when the figure made a growling sound, a tactic Marcus often used to frighten us during games. Abandoning my hiding place, I ran deeper into the woods, laughing at first, believing this was just part of the game. I heard Ben crashing through the underbrush nearby, apparently also fleeing. We converged at the back edge of the property nearly a mile from the house, where we encountered what we thought was Marcus emerging from between two large pine trees. The figure moved strangely, with a kind of stilted, yet fluid motion that didn't match my cousin's usual gait. When it stepped into a patch of moonlight, I noticed something that sent ice through my veins. Though the silhouette resembled Marcus in general shape, the proportions were wrong, as if someone had stretched his image slightly in all directions. The figure made that growling sound again and moved toward us with an odd, gliding step. Ben grabbed my arm and we ran toward the gravel road, certain Marcus was playing an elaborate prank to scare us. When we reached the road, we looked back to see the figure emerge from the tree line, moving in a strangely triumphant manner, almost strutting but with jerky, uncoordinated movements. We sprinted the rest of the way to the house, where we decided to barricade the door as payback for the fright. Laughing nervously, we pushed a small bookcase against the entrance, then decided to add the heavy coffee table as well. As we loudly dragged the table across the hardwood floor, a door opened behind us. Marcus appeared in the hallway, rubbing his eyes, clearly just awakened from sleep. "What the hell are you guys doing?" he asked, his voice thick with drowsiness. The realization hit us simultaneously. If Marcus was inside the house, who or what had we seen in the woods? We tried explaining what we'd seen, our words tumbling over each other in panicked confusion. Marcus listened, his expression transitioning from irritation to concern to tightly controlled fear. He ordered us to our bedroom, telling us to lock the door and not come out until he called for us. Through the bedroom window, I watched him check the exterior doors and windows, then take a rifle from the gun cabinet, a .30-06 our grandfather had used for deer hunting. He loaded it methodically before stepping onto the front porch. He stood there for several minutes, scanning the darkness, before walking the perimeter of the cleared area, the rifle held ready. We huddled together in silence, straining to hear any sound that might indicate trouble. After what seemed like hours but was probably 20 minutes, Marcus returned to the house. When he came to our room, his face was composed, but I noticed his hands trembling slightly as he returned the key to his pocket. "Nothing to worry about," he said with forced cheerfulness. "Just me playing a joke on you earlier. You kids have overactive imaginations." But his eyes told a different story, and I noticed he checked the locks twice before going to bed. He also moved his sleeping bag into the hallway outside our room, claiming he was too tall for the couch but obviously positioning himself between us and the front door. None of us slept well that night. Every creak of the old house settling, every whisper of wind through the trees outside jolted me awake. Sometime around dawn, I heard Marcus moving around the kitchen making coffee. When we finally emerged for breakfast, he looked exhausted with dark circles under his eyes, suggesting he'd barely slept. The rest of the weekend passed without incident, but an unspoken tension hung over us. We stayed close to the house, playing board games and watching movies instead of venturing into the woods. When my mother arrived on Sunday to take me home, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief that I couldn't explain to her. For several years after the incident, I avoided visiting Grandmother Eleanor's property alone. When family gatherings required my presence, I made excuses to stay indoors after sunset and refused to participate in any games that involved the wooded areas of the property. My direct experiences with Black Ridge National Park continued, however. My father, an avid fisherman, frequently took me to the park's numerous streams and lakes. During these trips, I began noticing details I'd previously overlooked, or perhaps subconsciously avoided. On one fishing expedition when I was 12, we ventured to a remote lake accessible only by a 3-mile hiking trail. We arrived late in the afternoon and decided to stay until dusk to catch the evening insect hatch that would bring trout to the surface. As the sun dipped below the ridgeline and shadows lengthened across the water, I noticed an unusual stillness descend over the lake. The constant background chorus of birdsong and insect noise abruptly ceased, creating a vacuum of silence that felt almost physical in its intensity. My father, focused on landing a particularly large trout, didn't seem to notice. Scanning the shoreline, I spotted what appeared to be a figure standing perfectly still among a cluster of birch trees on the opposite bank. The distance was too great to discern details, but something about its posture, unnaturally erect and motionless, raised the hairs on my arms. When I pointed it out to my father, he squinted across the water before shrugging. "Probably just a dead tree," he said. "Your eyes play tricks in this light." But when I looked again, the figure had moved several yards to the right, still maintaining that perfect stillness that no human could achieve. I insisted we leave immediately, inventing a story about homework I'd forgotten was due the next day. My father, noting my obvious distress, agreed without much argument. As we hiked back to the car in the rapidly fading light, I repeatedly glanced over my shoulder, unable to shake the sensation of being followed. Twice I thought I glimpsed movement on the trail behind us, not the natural motion of wildlife, but something deliberate and calculating. That night, I experienced the first of what would become recurring nightmares. In my dream, I stood alone in a clearing within Black Ridge, surrounded by towering pines that blocked most of the moonlight. From the darkness between the trees, multiple sets of eyes watched me. Not animal eyes reflecting light, but something more aware, more intelligent. When I tried to run, my legs moved with agonizing slowness, as if wading through deep water. I woke gasping for breath, sheets soaked with sweat, convinced for several terrifying seconds that I was still in that clearing, still being watched by whatever lurked in Black Ridge's deepest recesses. 3 years passed. I was 13, navigating the complexities of middle school and beginning to question many of the beliefs and fears of my childhood. During summer break, I attended a family reunion at a state park facility far from Black Ridge. Marcus, now graduated from college and working as an environmental engineer, attended with his fiancée. Late in the evening, after most of the family had retired to their cabins, Marcus and I found ourselves alone by the dying embers of the communal fire pit. We talked about his job, my interest in photography, and eventually, inevitably, about Black Ridge. "Do you remember that night at Grandma's house?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "The night we thought we saw you in the woods?" Marcus stared into the glowing coals for a long moment before answering. "I've been waiting for you to bring that up," he said quietly. "I figured one of you would eventually." He took a deep breath. "I lied to you kids that night. What you saw wasn't me playing a joke. And it wasn't your imagination." The truth, as Marcus explained it, was both more mundane and more terrifying than the supernatural explanations I'd contemplated over the years. The figure we encountered likely wasn't a forest spirit or mythological entity, but a human, albeit one with disturbing intentions. "The Park Service doesn't publicize it much," Marcus said, "but there have been reports for decades about someone, or possibly several individuals, living deep in Black Ridge's most remote areas. People who've gone feral, for lack of a better term." He explained that according to his research, which included reviewing incident reports from park rangers and interviewing longtime residents, at least 3 people had gone missing in Black Ridge in the 1970s, whose bodies were never recovered. One theory held that these individuals hadn't perished, but had chosen to remain in the wilderness, gradually losing connection with civilization and adapting to a primitive existence. "The human mind can deteriorate in isolation," Marcus explained. "Combined with the challenges of wilderness survival and possible pre-existing mental health issues, it's not inconceivable that someone could regress to an almost animal-like state." What we had encountered, Marcus believed, was one such individual, someone who had observed our family from a distance and perhaps developed a fixation on the property or on us. The strange movement and posture could be explained by years of moving through dense forest, muscles developed for different purposes than typical human locomotion. "I've seen it more than once," he admitted. "The first time was when I was about your age. I was hiking alone near the property line and spotted someone watching me from the underbrush. When they realized I'd seen them, they moved in this bizarre quadrupedal way, like a human trying to move like an animal. It was deeply unsettling." Marcus had reported his encounters to park rangers over the years, but with limited evidence and no direct threat established, little action had been taken beyond increasing patrols in the area. The vast territory and limited resources made comprehensive searches impossible. "I didn't tell you kids the truth back then because I didn't want to terrify you," he said. "But you're old enough now to understand the real dangers in the park aren't supernatural. They're human, and in some ways, that's more frightening." The revelation should have been reassuring, a rational explanation replacing childhood fears of the unknown. Instead, it intensified my unease about Black Ridge. Somehow the idea of individuals choosing to abandon humanity, to exist in some halfway state between person and predator, disturbed me on a profound level. I'm 18 now, about to leave for college in another state. My relationship with Black Ridge has evolved into a cautious respect. I still hike its trails and occasionally fish its streams, but always with companions, always departing well before dusk, and never venturing into its more remote regions. Grandmother Eleanor passed away last winter. The old property has been sold, the house renovated by new owners unaware of its history. I wonder sometimes if they've experienced anything unusual, if they've glimpsed movement at the forest's edge or felt the weight of unseen eyes, watching from the darkness. The national park continues to report occasional disappearances, usually attributed to hikers, underestimating the wilderness or failing to prepare adequately. The official statistics show Black Ridge's incident rate as comparable to other parks of similar size and terrain, but locals know better than to take those figures at face value. What troubles me most isn't the possibility that feral humans might inhabit Blackridge's deepest recesses. It's the recognition that the boundary between civilization and wilderness, between human and animal, may be more permeable than we care to admit. Something in that vast ancient forest calls to the primitive parts of our psyche, parts we've suppressed but never fully eliminated. 2 months ago, I hiked to Ravenwood Overlook, a popular viewpoint about 2 miles into the park. As I rested on a boulder, enjoying the panoramic vista, I spotted a hiker on an adjacent ridge. Something about their movement caught my attention, a subtle but distinctive irregularity in their gait. For a moment, our gazes seemed to meet across the distance. The figure raised a hand in what might have been a greeting but felt more like a claim staked, a boundary established. I left immediately, maintaining a brisk pace all the way back to the parking area. As I drove away, I checked my rearview mirror repeatedly, unable to shake the sensation of being followed. This is my warning to those who visit national parks, particularly Blackridge. Respect the wilderness not just for the natural dangers it presents, the weather, the terrain, the wildlife, but for the more insidious threat it poses to human identity itself. There's something in these ancient forests that can unmake a person, can erase the thin veneer of civilization, and expose the creature beneath. The parks are carefully managed, patrolled and mapped, creating an illusion of control and safety. But these are just human constructs laid over something far older and more powerful. The wilderness watches, waits, and occasionally reaches out to claim one of us. Be vigilant when you venture beyond the trail markers and campgrounds. And if you ever sense you're being watched, if the forest falls suddenly silent around you, if motion at the corner of your vision disappears when you turn to look, don't dismiss it as imagination. Trust your instincts and leave before darkness falls. Some parts of the wild were never meant for us, and some who enter never truly return, even if they walk out on their own 2 feet. It began in the autumn of 2019, when the leaves in our small town of Pine Creek turned crimson and gold. The air carried that distinct chill that settles into your bones and makes you long for warmth. I had just ended a 3-year relationship with Michael, my high school sweetheart. We had grown apart as often happens when adolescence gives way to adulthood, our paths diverging in ways neither of us anticipated. The breakup itself wasn't dramatic. We simply acknowledged that what we once had was no longer there. What followed, however, set in motion a series of events that would forever alter my perception of reality. 2 weeks after our separation, Michael began dating Veronica Reyes. In our town of barely 5,000 residents, news traveled fast. Veronica had moved to Pine Creek from somewhere in New Mexico the previous year and quickly established a reputation. She lived alone in a weathered Victorian house at the edge of town that had belonged to her grandmother. The locals whispered about her, calling her eccentric at best and dangerous at worst. Veronica openly practiced what she called the old ways. She referred to herself as a bruja, or sometimes a lacusa, a shapeshifter from Hispanic folklore. Most people dismissed her claims as attention-seeking behavior, but there was something about her that made even skeptics uncomfortable. Her eyes, deep brown with flecks of amber, seemed to hold knowledge beyond her years. When she looked at you, it felt as though she was examining something beneath your skin. I first met her at the local grocery store where I worked part-time. She would come in every Thursday evening, always purchasing the same items: candles, certain herbs, butcher's meat, and milk. She rarely spoke but would acknowledge me with a slight nod. After she began dating Michael, those nods transformed into something resembling a smirk. "She's just trying to get under your skin," my coworker Denise insisted. "Don't let her." But something about Veronica's presence lingered. It wasn't jealousy. Michael and I had ended things amicably, but a sense of unease that intensified whenever she was near. By November, stories about Veronica's midnight gatherings circulated throughout town. People reported strange lights from her house and the sound of chanting carried on the wind. Most disturbing were the rumors about her pets. Veronica kept numerous cats, at least 7 when I first became aware of them, but they had a tendency to disappear or die under mysterious circumstances. "That's the 5th one this year," Denise whispered one afternoon when Veronica came in to buy cat food. The veterinarian's son told me she brought in her latest one last week. Perfectly healthy cat suddenly dead with no explanation. Anyone familiar with cats knows they're resilient creatures. For 5 to die within 12 months under one person's care seemed beyond coincidental. Some speculated she was experimenting on them. Others whispered darker theories. I tried to distance myself from the gossip, focusing instead on building my new life without Michael. I had started dating James, who worked as a mechanic at his father's garage. James was pragmatic, grounded, and entirely uninterested in town gossip or supernatural speculation. His presence in my life felt like a counterbalance to the strange undercurrents that seemed to be swirling around Pine Creek. But despite my attempts to move forward, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, waiting for the precise moment to reveal itself. The first incident occurred in early December. I was closing the grocery store alone, something I'd done countless times before without incident. As I locked the front door, the parking lot lights flickered momentarily. When they stabilized, I glimpsed a figure standing at the edge of the lot, partially obscured by shadow. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding small against the vastness of the empty lot. The figure didn't respond but seemed to shift slightly. I couldn't discern its features, but something about its proportions seemed wrong. The head too large for the body, the arms too long. I blinked and it was gone. I dismissed the experience as fatigue. The holiday season meant longer hours and increased stress, but in the following weeks similar occurrences multiplied. Objects in my apartment moved when I wasn't looking. The distinct sensation of being watched intensified when I was alone. Twice I woke to find my bedroom window open, despite having closed it before sleeping. James attributed these events to forgetfulness or imagination. "You're working too hard," he'd say, his practical nature unable to accommodate the possibility of something inexplicable. In mid-December, I encountered Veronica at the local coffee shop. She sat alone in the corner, a leather-bound journal open before her. Our eyes met across the room and she motioned for me to join her. Against my better judgment, I did. "How have you been sleeping?" she asked without preamble, her gaze intense. "Fine," I lied, unsettled by the question. "Interesting." She closed her journal. "Your energy is disturbed. Something has noticed you." "What does that mean?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She smiled thinly. "We live in a world where the seen and unseen coexist. Most people go their entire lives without encountering the latter. You, however, have caught attention." "Is this because of Michael? Are you threatening me?" Veronica laughed, a sound like glass breaking. "This has nothing to do with him. This is much older than any relationship. But be careful. Recognition goes both ways. Once you see it, it sees you more clearly too." She gathered her belongings and left before I could respond, leaving me with a sensation of dread that settled in my stomach like a stone. That evening, I discovered my cat Milo sitting rigidly on my windowsill, staring into the darkness outside. His fur stood on end and a low growl emanated from his throat. When I approached, he hissed, something he had never done before, and fled under the bed, refusing to emerge for hours. The following morning, I found strange markings in the dirt beneath my bedroom window. They resembled footprints but were oddly shaped, too narrow with what appeared to be 4 digits instead of 5. James insisted they were probably raccoon tracks, but they didn't match any animal prints I'd ever seen. As December progressed, more people in town reported unusual experiences. Dogs refused to walk down certain streets. Children spoke of seeing a tall shadow person, watching them from the trees near the elementary school. 3 more cats disappeared from homes near Veronica's house. The town's collective anxiety grew, though most attributed it to winter's gloom or the pressure of the approaching holidays. I knew better. Something had changed in Pine Creek, and somehow, I sensed it was connected to me. The dream came on the winter solstice, the longest night of the year. I had fallen asleep on my living room couch while watching television. The transition from wakefulness to dreaming was seamless, so much so that at first, I didn't realize I'd crossed the threshold. In the dream, I stood at the edge of a forest I recognized as the woods beyond Pine Creek. The trees were barren, their branches reaching toward a moonless sky like skeletal fingers. The air felt dense, resistant, as if I were moving through water rather than atmosphere. From the darkness between the trees, Veronica emerged. She wore a long white dress that seemed to glow with its own light. Her hair, usually pulled back, hung loose around her shoulders. But her face was what triggered the first jolt of true fear. Her features were hers, but somehow altered. Her eyes had expanded, consuming too much of her face, and reflected light like an animal's. Her mouth stretched wider than humanly possible, revealing teeth that appeared too numerous and too sharp. "I tried to warn you," she said. Her voice layered with other sounds, rustling leaves, distant whispers, the cry of an owl. "But you weren't listening." "Warn me about what?" I asked, my dream self attempting to retreat but finding myself rooted in place. "About what watches from the edges. About what waits for recognition." She approached, her movements fluid yet wrong, as if her joints functioned differently from a human's. "They've existed alongside us always, but few noticed them. You did. Whether intentionally or not, you opened a door." "I don't understand," I said, panic rising in my chest. Veronica stopped inches from me. I could smell something on her breath, a strange metallic scent like old pennies. "Understanding isn't required for participation. You're part of it now. The Watcher has chosen you, and there's no undoing that connection." She reached out, her fingers elongating as they approached my face. "It wears many forms, sometimes mine, sometimes others. But its true appearance, well, few witness that and remain unchanged." Her hand touched my cheek, and her skin felt cold and textured like snake scales. "Listen carefully. When it comes, and it will come, don't acknowledge it. Don't speak to it. Don't whistle back. Whistle back," I repeated, confused. Veronica's face contorted into an expression of malevolent glee. "Yes, it calls to those it selects. A sound like human whistling, but hollow, empty. If you answer, you invite it closer." The dream shifted suddenly. I was no longer in the forest, but standing in my childhood bedroom. Veronica was gone. Instead, a shadow stretched across the wall, a silhouette that resembled nothing human. It moved independently of any light source, growing larger until it covered the entire wall. From within the darkness came a whistling sound, 3 descending notes, followed by 2 ascending. The shadow began to peel itself from the wall, gaining dimension, reaching toward me. I woke with a violent start, my heart hammering against my ribs. Sweat had soaked through my clothes despite the winter chill. The television still played, casting blue light across my living room. Everything appeared normal, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed. The dream felt not like a product of my subconscious, but a message. A warning delivered with deliberate intent. I reached for my phone, checking the time. 3:33 a.m., the witching hour, as my grandmother would have called it. Without fully understanding why, I knew I needed to talk to my mother. Not my father, who would dismiss my concerns, nor James, whose practical nature couldn't accommodate the inexplicable. My mother had always been more receptive to the possibility that reality extended beyond what could be easily explained. I texted her, "Need to talk. Important. Tomorrow morning?" Her reply came surprisingly quickly for such a late hour. "Everything okay? Meet me at 9. I spent the remainder of the night with every light in my apartment illuminated, unable to close my eyes again until dawn broke the darkness. The following morning arrived with an oppressive gray sky that threatened snow. My mother called shortly after 8, suggesting we meet away from home. "Your father's working on his hobby projects today," she explained. "We'll have more privacy elsewhere." We agreed to meet at a gas station convenience store several miles from our subdivision, neutral territory where we could speak freely. I arrived first, purchasing 2 coffees and claiming a small table near the window. When my mother entered, I immediately noticed her concerned expression. "You look terrible," she said, sliding into the seat across from me. "What's happened?" I recounted everything, the strange occurrences around town, my uncomfortable encounter with Veronica, and finally, the vivid dream that had prompted our meeting. My mother listened without interruption, her face growing increasingly grave. The dream felt real, I concluded, like she was actually communicating with me, not just some figment of my imagination. My mother was silent for several moments, turning her coffee cup slowly between her palms. Finally, she spoke, her voice low. There are things in this world that most people go their entire lives without encountering. Your grandfather, my father, believed in them strongly. He grew up in a small village where such beliefs weren't considered superstition, but practical knowledge for survival. She looked out the window, her gaze distant. When I was about 12, he woke all of us children in the middle of the night. He said he needed to show us something important, something we needed to recognize so we could protect ourselves. What was it? I asked, leaning forward. He took us to the edge of the property where the forest began. It was a moonlit night, and he pointed to a figure moving between the trees. At first, I thought it was a large owl. We had many in the area, but as it turned, her voice faltered. What did you see? Its proportions were wrong. Too tall and thin for an owl, with limbs that bent at unnatural angles. And its face, she shuddered visibly. It had features that resembled a woman's but distorted. Eyes too large and entirely black. Where a beak should have been, it had something more like a mouth, twisted into a perpetual grimace. My blood ran cold as she described exactly what I'd been dreaming about. Grandfather called it La Lechuza, the owl witch. He said that in our ancestral traditions, they were believed to be women who had made pacts with dark forces, gaining the ability to transform, but he believed they were something older, something that had existed before humans named them. What do they want? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Connection, my mother replied. Recognition. Your grandfather said they select individuals who can perceive them, often those with sensitivity to the unseen world. Once recognized, they form a bond that's difficult to break. But why me? I've never been particularly sensitive to anything supernatural. My mother reached across the table and took my hand. These things often run in families. Your grandmother had what she called the sight, and I've experienced things throughout my life that I can't explain. You may have inherited this sensitivity without realizing it. What can I do? The desperation in my voice was evident. First, you must understand that acknowledging its presence strengthens its connection to you. If you hear whistling, especially at night, do not respond. Do not whistle back. That's seen as an invitation. We spent nearly 20 minutes discussing protective measures, salt lines at doorways and windows, specific herbs to keep in the house, prayers or mantras from various traditions that might offer protection. Throughout our conversation, I felt a growing sense of urgency, as if time were running out. As we prepared to leave, my mother insisted on following me home. I don't want you driving alone right now. You're shaken. We paid for our coffees and walked to our respective vehicles. As we pulled onto the main road, something caught my attention on the street leading to our subdivision. A dark figure stood motionless on the roadside. I leaned forward, straining to see more clearly. What I had initially taken for a person was much too small, perhaps 2 feet tall. As we approached, the figure turned toward our passing car. What faced me defied rational explanation. It had the general shape of an owl but stood upright on what appeared to be thin, jointed legs. Its wings, folded against its body, resembled arms ending in claw-like hands, but it was the face that caused me to gasp in horror. The creature had pale, almost translucent skin stretched over vaguely human features. Its eyes were enormous and entirely black. Not the reflection-filled eyes of a nocturnal bird, but empty voids that seemed to absorb light. Below them was a hooked beak that opened slightly as we passed, revealing what looked disturbingly like human teeth within. Time seemed to slow as our eyes met. My horrified gaze locked with its bottomless black orbs. I felt a wave of dread wash over me, so intense that I cried out involuntarily. This wasn't mere fear, but a primal recognition of something fundamentally wrong. Something that should not exist in our reality, yet clearly did. Mom, do you see that? I cried, pointing frantically. She glanced in the direction I indicated but showed no reaction. See what? What's wrong? There, right there. The thing by the road. My voice had risen to a near scream. My mother immediately slowed the car and began to reverse. I turned in my seat, searching desperately for the creature, but it had vanished completely. The roadside stood empty, showing no signs of disturbance. We sat in silence for several minutes, the car idling as I explained what I had seen. My mother's face had gone pale. It's happening faster than I thought, she said quietly. It's showing itself to you directly now. But why couldn't you see it? I demanded, still trembling. Because it's not choosing me, she replied simply. It's chosen you. The next several days passed in a blur of anxiety and research. I called in sick to work, unable to face normal interactions while my understanding of reality was crumbling. James came by daily, bringing food and offering practical support despite his skepticism. Maybe you should talk to someone professional, he suggested gently, after I flinched at a shadow cast by a passing car. There's no shame in getting help for anxiety. I couldn't explain that what I was experiencing went beyond anxiety. How could I make him understand that the boundary between our world and something else had become permeable in my presence? Instead, I channeled my energy into research. I spent hours online, searching for information about owl women, shapeshifters, and entities that whistle in the night. The results were both illuminating and terrifying. Across multiple cultures and continents, similar entities appeared in folklore. La Lechuza in Mexican tradition, the Strix in ancient Roman mythology, the Lilith of Hebrew texts, all shared characteristics with what I had seen. Women who transformed into owl-like creatures, often as punishment or through dark pacts, beings that lured their victims with whistling sounds or called their names in familiar voices. One account from a small town in northern Mexico particularly chilled me. My grandfather told us never to answer when we heard whistling at night. A man in his village did. They found him 3 days later in the forest. His body was intact but empty, as if something had hollowed him out from the inside. Another report from Arizona described a woman's encounter. It perched on my roof for 3 nights. Each night it would scratch at the shingles and whistle, 3 descending notes, then 2 ascending. On the 3rd night it spoke my name in my mother's voice. I almost opened the window before I remembered my grandmother's warning. The pattern was clear. These entities, whatever they truly were, selected individuals, made their presence known gradually, and then attempted to establish deeper contact. Those who responded or acknowledged them faced consequences ranging from persistent haunting to disappearance or death. By the 3rd day of my research, physical symptoms began to manifest. I developed a persistent headache centered behind my eyes. Sounds became unnaturally amplified. The hum of the refrigerator, the tick of the wall clock, the rustle of trees outside my window all seemed to carry hidden messages. Most disturbing was the sensation of being continually observed, even in the most private moments. On the 4th night, I received a text from Michael, something unusual since we rarely communicated after our breakup. Need to talk about V. Something's wrong. Can we meet? I hesitated, suspecting a trap not from Michael but from whatever had attached itself to me. The entity had shown an ability to mimic or influence others. Could it be using Michael now to lure me out? I replied cautiously, "What's going on?" His response came quickly. "She's been talking about you. Says you've seen something you shouldn't have. She's different lately. Scary different." We arranged to meet the following day at a busy cafe in the center of town, a public place where I felt marginally safer. But sleep that night proved impossible. Around 2 in the morning, I heard it for the first time. From somewhere outside my bedroom window came a distinct whistling, 3 descending notes followed by 2 ascending ones. Exactly the pattern described in my research. Exactly the sound from my dream. I froze, barely breathing as the sound repeated. It seemed to come from directly outside my 2nd-story window, a physical impossibility for any normal being. My cat Milo, who had been sleeping at the foot of my bed, arched his back and hissed at the window. The whistling continued, growing slightly louder, more insistent. Then, most terrifyingly, it was joined by a voice, my mother's voice. "Sweetheart, are you awake? I need to talk to you. Can you open the window?" Every instinct screamed that this was not my mother. She would never come to my apartment at this hour, would never ask me to open a window rather than using the door. This was the entity, using familiarity as a lure. I remained motionless, silent, clutching my blankets as cold sweat beaded on my forehead. After what seemed like hours but was likely only minutes, the whistling and false voice ceased. In the silence that followed, I heard a slow scraping sound moving across my roof, like something with claws dragging itself toward the opposite side of the building. Morning couldn't come fast enough. I met Michael at the cafe as planned, arriving early to secure a table with a clear view of all entrances. He appeared haggard, with dark circles under his eyes and a nervousness I'd never observed in him before. "Veronica's not well," he said after ordering coffee. "Something's happened to her. Or maybe she was always like this and I just didn't see it." "What do you mean?" I asked, maintaining a careful distance across the table. "She talks in her sleep, languages I don't recognize. She disappears for hours without explanation. And the animals," he shuddered visibly. "Another cat died yesterday. Just stopped breathing while sitting on her lap. She showed no reaction, just put it in a box and took it outside." I listened, connecting his observations with what I already knew or suspected. "When did this behavior start?" "It was always there in smaller ways, but it intensified about a week ago." He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "She mentioned you specifically, said you had opened yourself to something ancient, that it had chosen you as a vessel. A vessel for what?" The question escaped before I could consider whether I truly wanted the answer. Michael shook his head. "She wouldn't say, but she seemed almost envious. Like you'd been given an opportunity she had sought for herself." Our conversation continued, with Michael sharing increasingly disturbing details about Veronica's behavior. Throughout, I had the distinct impression we were being watched, though the cafe contained only the usual morning crowd of students and remote workers. As we prepared to leave, Michael grabbed my arm. "Be careful. Whatever's happening, whatever she thinks is happening, it's dangerous. Veronica isn't who I thought she was." I returned home to find James waiting in his truck outside my apartment. His presence was reassuring, a connection to normalcy that I desperately needed. I hadn't told him about meeting Michael, knowing his tendency toward jealousy despite his otherwise practical nature. We spent the evening watching movies, deliberately avoiding any that might touch on supernatural themes. For a few hours, the constant dread that had accompanied me for days receded slightly. James ordered takeout, made jokes about his demanding customers at the garage, and treated me with the casual affection that had drawn me to him initially. Around 11, as the credits rolled on our second film, a loud thud sounded from above, something heavy landing on the roof of my apartment. James immediately muted the television. "What was that?" We sat in silence listening. After a few seconds, the sound came again. A distinct impact followed by what sounded like scraping or scratching movements across the shingles. "Probably raccoons," James suggested, but his expression betrayed uncertainty. "Or maybe branches from that oak tree hitting the roof in the wind." I knew better. The night was still without enough breeze to move branches, and raccoons, while common in our area, didn't move with such deliberate, measured sounds. This was rhythmic, almost purposeful. The scraping continued, tracing what seemed to be a circular pattern directly above my living room. Occasionally it would pause, then resume with greater intensity. During one such pause, I heard it, the whistling, faint but unmistakable. "Do you hear that?" I whispered, clutching James's arm. He frowned, concentrating. "Hear what?" "The whistling. 3 notes down, 2 up." James shook his head. "I don't hear any whistling. Just the scratching." The realization that the sound was audible only to me intensified my terror. This confirmed what my mother had said. The entity was communicating specifically with me, establishing a connection only I could perceive. The scratching suddenly stopped. Complete silence descended, somehow more frightening than the noise had been. James, ever practical, stood up. "I'm going to check it out," he announced, moving toward the door. "No." I grabbed his hand. "Please don't go out there." "It's probably nothing dangerous," he reassured me. "But we should make sure nothing's damaged. If there's an animal trapped up there, it could cause problems." Despite my protest, James's practical nature won out. He stepped outside, walking to the front of the apartment building where he could see the roof. I remained inside, trembling, watching through the window as he backed into the driveway and looked upward. After a moment, he returned, his expression puzzled. "There's nothing there. Whatever it was is gone now." "Did you see anything? Any evidence of what it might have been?" James shook his head. "The roof looks undisturbed. No branches, no animals, nothing." We spent the remainder of the night in uneasy silence. James eventually dozed off on the couch, but sleep eluded me entirely. I sat vigil until morning, listening for any return of the sounds, jumping at every natural creak of the building. When dawn finally broke, James prepared to leave for his early shift at the garage. At the door, he hesitated. "Look, I know you're going through something right now. I don't understand it, and honestly, some of it sounds far-fetched, but I care about you. Maybe consider talking to someone professional? Or stay with your parents for a few days." I nodded, not having the energy to explain again why conventional help wouldn't address what was happening. After he left, I examined my ceiling carefully, looking for any signs of disturbance from above. There were none. No water stains, no scrape marks visible from the inside. Yet when I ventured outside to check the roof from James's vantage point, I discovered something he had somehow missed or that had appeared after his inspection. A perfect circle of displaced shingles, approximately 3 feet in diameter, directly above my living room. The following week brought an intensification of activity that I could no longer attribute to imagination or coincidence. Objects in my apartment moved when I wasn't looking, not just small displacements but significant rearrangements. I would leave a room with books on the shelf and return to find them stacked on the floor in perfect towers. Photographs on my walls rotated 180 degrees. Most disturbingly, I once found all my kitchen knives removed from their drawer and arranged in a circular pattern on my bedroom floor while I showered. The whistling continued nightly, sometimes accompanied by scratching at my windows or tapping on glass. Twice I received phone calls from my own number, calls that, when answered, contained only the sound of breathing and that distinctive whistling pattern. My physical health deteriorated rapidly. I lost weight as my appetite vanished. Dark circles formed under my eyes from lack of sleep. At work, customers commented on my appearance, their concern evident even through polite inquiries. My mother visited daily, bringing protective items from various spiritual traditions: a crucifix, sage bundles for smudging, small bags of herbs to place in corners of rooms. Nothing seemed to diminish the entity's presence or interest. It's growing. Stronger, she observed one evening after helping me clean up yet another inexplicable mess. All the contents of my refrigerator emptied onto the kitchen floor while I'd been in the bathroom for less than 5 minutes. "The connection between you is deepening. How do I break it?" I asked, desperation evident in my voice. My mother hesitated before answering. "Traditional methods say you must remove yourself from its territory, go somewhere far away where it hasn't established a presence. Or you must find someone who can communicate with it directly and negotiate your release." "Someone like Veronica," I said, the realization dawning. "Possibly. If she truly is what she claims to be, she might understand these entities better than most." The suggestion of seeking help from Veronica, the person who seemed somehow connected to the beginning of my ordeal, felt wrong. Yet I was running out of options and strength to continue resisting alone. That night, after my mother left, the entity made its boldest move yet. I had finally fallen into an exhausted sleep around midnight when a sound woke me, a light tapping at my bedroom window. In my half-conscious state, I turned toward the sound. Through the glass, illuminated by moonlight, was a face. Not the owl-like creature I had glimpsed before, but a human face. My own face, looking back at me with an expression I'd never worn. My doppelganger smiled, revealing teeth too numerous and sharp to be human, and raised a finger to tap the glass again. I screamed, scrambling backward across my bed until I hit the opposite wall. The face remained, watching my terror with evident satisfaction. It raised a hand, a distorted mirror of my own, and beckoned, mouthing words I couldn't hear through the glass but somehow understood. "Let me in." I fumbled for my phone, calling James despite the late hour. By the time he answered, the figure at my window had vanished, leaving no trace on the glass, no fingerprints, no breath condensation. James arrived 20 minutes later to find me huddled in my living room, every light blazing. When I described what I'd seen, concern deepened in his expression. "I think you're experiencing some kind of psychosis," he said gently. "These things you're describing, they're not physically possible. A face identical to yours outside a second-story window, objects moving when you're not looking. It sounds like you're having a mental health crisis." His disbelief, though painful, wasn't surprising. How could I expect him to comprehend something that defied conventional reality? To him, the explanation of hallucination or delusion was far more plausible than an entity from folklore manifesting in Pine Creek. Stay with me tonight, he urged. Tomorrow we'll get you some help. I didn't argue, knowing that spending the night alone would be unbearable. We drove to his apartment across town, where I collapsed onto his couch, emotionally and physically exhausted. As I drifted toward uneasy sleep, my phone chimed with a text message. It was from Michael. Veronica's gone. Left everything behind. Note on her table said only, "It has chosen. I am no longer needed. Do you know what that means?" I stared at the message, a new level of dread settling over me. If Veronica had departed, possibly the only person who understood what was happening to me had removed herself from the equation. I was truly alone in facing whatever had attached itself to my life. Sleep finally claimed me but brought no respite. In my dreams, I walked through Pine Creek, but the town was empty of people. Buildings stood abandoned, doors swinging open in a wind I couldn't feel. At the center of town waited the creature, no longer bothering with disguise or partial manifestation. It stood fully revealed, a towering, emaciated figure with the general structure of a human woman, but elongated beyond possibility. Its skin pale and translucent, its limbs bending at additional joints. The owl-like face I had glimpsed before was merely one aspect of something far more complex and ancient. It spoke without moving its beak-like mouth, the words appearing directly in my mind. Recognition is complete. The vessel is prepared. The merging begins. I woke gasping for air, dawn light filtering through James's curtains. He was already up, making coffee in the kitchen. For a moment, normality seemed possible. The routine of morning, the smell of coffee, the sound of someone else moving around the apartment. Then I caught sight of my reflection in his television screen and froze. My face looked wrong, my eyes slightly larger than they should be, my smile stretching just a fraction too wide. I raised a hand to touch my cheek, and my reflection did the same, but with a slight delay, as if it were not truly mimicking me but making its own decision to move. The merging had begun. I left James's apartment while he showered, unable to face his continued skepticism or well-intentioned suggestions of psychiatric intervention. What was happening to me existed beyond the boundaries of conventional medicine or therapy. The entity was no longer content with external manifestation. It had begun the process of possession or transformation. I drove to the one place that might hold answers: Veronica's abandoned house at the edge of town. The Victorian structure looked more decrepit than I remembered, its paint peeling, shutters hanging askew. The front door stood partially open, swinging slightly in the morning breeze. Entering felt like crossing a threshold in more ways than the physical. Inside, the house was in disarray, furniture overturned, books scattered across floors, walls marked with symbols drawn in what appeared to be ash or charcoal. The air smelled of incense, herbs, and something underneath, a metallic tang that reminded me of blood. In what must have been her living room, Veronica had created an altar of sorts. Candles of various colors surrounded a central space where a small carved figure stood, an owl-like creature with human features, similar to what I had seen. Before it lay the remains of offerings, dried flowers, small bones, coins, and a piece of paper with my name written on it. Behind the altar, the wall was covered with photographs, dozens of them arranged in a spiraling pattern. With mounting horror, I realized they were all of me walking to my car after work, me having coffee with my mother, me asleep on my couch, photographed through my window. The timeline of images spanned months, beginning long before my encounter with the creature, before my breakup with Michael, before Veronica had shown any interest in my existence. This hadn't started with my accidental recognition of the entity. It had been orchestrated from the beginning, Veronica selecting me, guiding the entity's attention toward me, facilitating the connection. The question was why. A journal lay open on a small table beside the altar. I picked it up, recognizing Veronica's handwriting from notes she had sometimes left for Michael. The final entry, dated the day before her disappearance, read, "The transference is nearly complete. The Watcher has accepted the vessel I prepared. Soon I will be released from my obligation. 3 generations of service ends with me. The debt will be paid." Earlier entries detailed her family's history, a pact made by her grandmother with what she called those who watch from edges in exchange for power, protection, and knowledge. The price had been steep. Each generation required to provide a new vessel when the previous one failed. Veronica had been raised specifically for this purpose, trained in rituals and methods to identify suitable candidates and facilitate the transfer. Had been selected not randomly but deliberately, chosen for qualities Veronica had identified as compatible with the entity's needs. My sensitivity to the unseen world, inherited through my mother's lineage, made me an ideal replacement vessel. The realization brought not just terror but rage. My life had been manipulated, my perception of reality shattered, all to fulfill someone else's obligation to an ancient entity. As I stood in that room, surrounded by evidence of the elaborate trap I had been led into, I felt a change within me. The constant fear that had accompanied me for weeks transformed into determination. If this entity had chosen me, if Veronica had selected me as a vessel, then perhaps I had more agency in this process than I had assumed. Gathered Veronica's journal and several other items that seemed significant. A small cloth bag of herbs labeled protection, a vial of liquid with no identification, and a silver pendant in the shape of an owl. I didn't have a plan yet, but knowledge was power, and these items represented the accumulated knowledge of generations. As I prepared to leave, a familiar whistling sound came from upstairs. 3 descending notes, 2 ascending. My heart raced, but the fear was now tempered with resolve. Instead of fleeing, I moved toward the sound, climbing the creaking staircase to the 2nd floor. The master bedroom door stood open. Inside, the room was surprisingly orderly compared to the chaos below. A large bed dominated the space, its covers neatly arranged. On the pillow lay a single feather, too large to belong to any ordinary bird. The whistling came again from directly behind me. I turned slowly, finally ready to face what had been pursuing me. It stood in the doorway, the entity in its full manifestation. Nearly 7 feet tall, its proportions inhumanly elongated with limbs that bent at additional joints. Its skin was pale and seemed to shift between solid and translucent. The face combined elements of owl and human woman in a way that should have been impossible. Crowned with feathers that were not quite feathers but something more like extensions of its being. "I see you," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "And I know why you're here." The entity tilted its head at an angle no human neck could achieve. When it spoke, the sound came not from its beak mouth but seemed to form directly in my mind. "The preparation is complete. The vessel is aware. The merging continues." Its mental voice carried overtones of something ancient, a sound like wind through abandoned places, like water running beneath frozen surfaces. "I'm not a vessel," I replied, drawing strength from my anger at being manipulated. "I'm a person. You can't take what isn't freely given." The entity moved closer, its movements fluid yet wrong. "All vessels resist initially. All vessels eventually accept. It is the nature of the becoming." I backed away until I felt the edge of the bed against my legs. Veronica prepared me without my knowledge or consent. That doesn't make it right or binding. Right, wrong, these are human concepts. The pact transcends such limitations. 3 generations of service for 3 generations of protection. The cycle continues. Understanding dawned fully. Veronica's family made a deal with you, but I made no such deal. I owe you nothing. The entity extended a limb toward me, its fingers too numerous and too long. The choice was made on your behalf. Resistance only prolongs discomfort. Acceptance brings transformation. I reached into my pocket, clutching the silver owl pendant I had taken from Veronica's altar. Something told me it held significance beyond mere symbolism. "You need consent," I said, an insight forming as I spoke. "Real power requires willing participation. That's why the process has been gradual. Why you've been trying to make me acknowledge you, respond to your calls. You need me to accept this." The entity's form seemed to flicker like a television with poor reception. The vessel understands more than anticipated. This increases value. "I'm not a vessel," I repeated, holding the pendant before me like a shield. "And I withdraw any recognition I've given you. I revoke any permission you think you have." The air in the room grew dense, charged with an energy that made my skin prickle. The entity's form became less distinct, its edges blurring into the surrounding space. "Rejection is temporary. Need is permanent. We will return when the vessel is more receptive." With those words, the entity seemed to fold inward upon itself, collapsing into dimensions that shouldn't exist, until nothing remained but a lingering scent of ozone and a single feather that drifted to the floor where it had stood. I left Veronica's house with her journal, the silver pendant, and a new understanding of what had been happening. The entity hadn't been destroyed or banished permanently. I wasn't naive enough to believe that. But I had asserted boundaries it seemed compelled to respect, at least temporarily. In the weeks that followed, the manifestations diminished gradually. The whistling at night ceased. Objects remained where I placed them. My reflection behaved as reflections should. I shared Veronica's journal with my mother, who recognized elements of the rituals and protections from her own family's traditions. Together, we strengthened the boundaries around our homes, using knowledge gleaned from both her ancestry and Veronica's recorded practices. Michael never heard from Veronica again. Her house eventually went into foreclosure, then was purchased by a developer who demolished it to build something new, erasing the physical evidence of what had transpired there. James and I parted ways amicably. The gulf between his perception of reality and what I had experienced proved too wide to bridge. He needed rational explanations. I had encountered something that defied rationality. I still wear the silver owl pendant daily, not as tribute or recognition, but as reminder and protection. Sometimes, in the liminal moments between waking and sleep, I sense a presence at the edges of perception. I hear the faintest echo of whistling, 3 notes down, 2 up. But I never respond. I never acknowledge. The entity waits for my defenses to weaken, for my resolve to falter. It is patient in a way only immortal things can be, and so am I vigilant in the way only those who have glimpsed beyond the veil can be. This isn't a story with a clean resolution or definitive ending. The watcher remains in the dark at the periphery, seeking recognition and acceptance. Sometimes I feel its gaze from unexpected angles, reflections in store windows, shadows that don't quite match their sources, dreams that feel more substantial than waking life. But I now understand what my grandfather knew, what my mother warned, what Veronica exploited. Recognition goes both ways. To see is to be seen. To acknowledge is to invite connection. So I keep my gaze averted from certain shadows. I ignore whistling in the night. And I wait, knowing that some entities measure time not in days or years, but in generations. The cycle continues, but on my terms. For now. August 2021 was supposed to be the perfect month for our expedition to Yosemite National Park. I had just turned 20, and as a graduation gift to myself, I convinced my Uncle Michael and his friend Gregory to take me on a hike to Half Dome. 2 of Greg's colleagues, Jasmine and Kimberly, joined our group, though their involvement in what happened was minimal at best. The drive from San Francisco to Yosemite took nearly 4 hours. I remember staring out the window as the landscape gradually transformed from urban sprawl to rolling hills, then to the majestic Sierra Nevada mountains. Michael drove while Greg navigated, occasionally sharing stories about previous hiking expeditions. The 2 had been friends since college, both experienced outdoorsmen who had conquered trails across California. "You're going to love it," Michael assured me, glancing in the rearview mirror. "Half Dome is challenging, but the view from the top is worth every step." I nodded, feigning confidence. The truth was, despite my enthusiasm, I felt anxious. This would be my most ambitious hike to date, a 16-mile round trip with over 4,800 feet of elevation gain. The cable section at the end, a notoriously steep climb up the rounded granite face of Half Dome, had featured in my nightmares for weeks leading up to our trip. We arrived at the park entrance in the late afternoon. The ranger who checked our permits was oddly somber. "Make sure you stay on the designated trails," she warned, her eyes lingering on me a moment too long. "We've had several hikers require rescue this season. The weather changes fast up there." As we pulled away, I noticed Greg watching the ranger's station shrink in the side mirror. "Strange woman," he muttered, almost like she didn't want us to go. "It's just standard safety talk," Michael replied, but I caught the slight uncertainty in his voice. Our campsite was situated about 20 minutes from the Mist Trail trailhead, nestled among towering pines. We arrived with enough daylight to set up camp, 2 tents and my hammock strung between sturdy trees. I preferred sleeping in the open air. Something about the gentle sway and the immediate connection to nature always helped me sleep better. At least that's what I believed before that night. After a simple dinner of freeze-dried meals heated over a portable stove, we reviewed our plan for the following day. The itinerary was aggressive. Wake at 4 a.m., begin hiking by 4:30, reach the summit by early afternoon and return before sunset. Remember, Michael emphasized, we stay together. No wandering off, no shortcuts. The trail can be disorienting, especially in the dark. If only we had adhered to that advice more strictly. As night fell, the temperature dropped rapidly. The stars emerged in spectacular fashion, the Milky Way stretching across the sky like a celestial highway. Under different circumstances, I would have stayed up to admire them. But knowing the early start ahead, I retreated to my hammock while the others settled into their tents. I drifted off to sleep with the gentle sounds of the forest around me, the distant hooting of an owl, the rustle of leaves in the light breeze, the occasional crackle from our dying campfire, normal, peaceful sounds that would soon give way to something entirely different. I woke with a start, my heart racing without apparent cause. The forest was different, quieter, as though holding its breath. My watch showed 3:30 a.m. I wasn't due to wake for another 30 minutes. But I felt completely alert, my senses heightened to an almost uncomfortable degree. The moon hung low and full, casting an unnatural brightness over our campsite. Every shadow appeared sharper, deeper, more defined than it should have been. I lay motionless in my hammock, trying to identify what had jarred me from sleep. There had been no nightmare, no sudden noise that I could recall. Just an overwhelming sensation that something wasn't right. I sat up slowly, scanning the perimeter of our camp. The tents containing the others stood motionless, their occupants presumably still asleep. Our gear remained untouched. Nothing appeared disturbed. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The forest floor, typically alive with the movement of nocturnal creatures, remained eerily still. Even the breeze had died down, leaving the trees in a rigid, unnatural pose like actors frozen mid-performance. I strained my ears, listening for anything out of place. At first, nothing but silence. Then, almost imperceptible, the sound of movement in the underbrush several yards beyond the reach of the moonlight. Not the familiar scurrying of a small animal, but something more deliberate, something heavier. Footsteps. I remained perfectly still, not daring to breathe. The footsteps continued, a slow, methodical circuit around our camp just beyond the visual threshold of the moonlight. Occasionally they would pause as though their owner was observing us, before resuming their patrol. After what felt like an eternity, the sounds receded, fading into the distance until I could no longer discern them from the ambient noises of the forest. I contemplated waking Michael and Greg, but hesitated. What would I say? That I heard footsteps? It could have been a park ranger doing routine checks, or perhaps a fellow camper who had lost their way. There was no reason to disturb everyone's sleep over what might be nothing. I lay back, but sleep refused to return. I fixated on the moonlight filtering through the canopy, creating dappled patterns that seemed to shift and contort, even without a breeze to move the branches. The sensation that I was being watched persisted, despite the silence that had returned to the forest. At 3:50 a.m., I decided to abandon the pretense of sleep. I slipped out of my hammock and approached Michael's tent, intending to suggest we get an early start. Before I could call out to him, the tent flap unzipped and he emerged, looking troubled. "Were you walking around?" he asked immediately, his voice hushed but urgent. "No," I replied, confused by the question. "I've been in my hammock. Why?" Michael glanced around the campsite, his expression guarded. "I woke up because I heard someone walking around. Not an animal, a person. Deliberate steps circling the camp." A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the pre-dawn temperature. "I heard it too," I admitted. "I thought I was imagining things." Greg emerged from his tent, already dressed. "Everything okay out here?" he asked, though something in his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Did you hear anything unusual?" Michael asked him. Greg hesitated before nodding. "Footsteps. Too heavy for an animal, too methodical for a lost hiker." He shrugged, attempting nonchalance. "Probably just a ranger checking the sights." We all agreed that must be the explanation. but I noticed none of us appeared convinced. By unspoken agreement, we began preparing for the hike earlier than planned, perhaps all equally eager to leave the campsite behind. As I gathered my gear, I caught Greg staring into the darkness beyond the campsite, his flashlight beam probing the dense foliage. For a moment I thought I saw the light reflect off something, a pair of eyes perhaps, but when I looked again there was nothing there. "Ready?" Michael asked, shouldering his pack. We nodded, and without further discussion headed toward the car. We reached the trailhead parking lot by 4:30 a.m., exactly as planned despite our early start. The pre-dawn air felt dense, almost stuffy, unusual for the typically crisp mountain mornings. A handful of other vehicles dotted the lot, fellow hikers with similar plans to beat the day's heat and crowds. I stepped out of the car, inhaling deeply, trying to clear the lingering unease from our disturbed night. The familiar scent of pine and earth should have been comforting, but something subtle lurked beneath those natural odors, something faintly metallic and unfamiliar. Michael busied himself checking our supplies, while Jasmine and Kimberly adjusted their hiking boots. Greg stretched his arms overhead, glancing toward a small concrete building near the trailhead. "I'm going to use the restroom before we start," he announced, grabbing his headlamp. "Be right back." I watched as Greg's figure retreated down the short path that led from the parking area to a T intersection with the main trail. The restroom facility stood directly across this intersection, through a small clearing. His light bobbed in the darkness until it disappeared behind the building. Michael realized he'd forgotten his hiking poles in the trunk and asked me to help retrieve them. We spent perhaps 5 minutes reorganizing gear before heading to the intersection to wait for Greg. The first hints of dawn had begun to lighten the eastern sky, though the forest remained shrouded in deep shadow. 5 minutes passed, then 10. "What's taking him so long?" Michael muttered, checking his watch. "I'll go check," I offered, crossing the small field to the restroom building. The structure contained 3 stalls, all empty. No sign of Greg. I called his name, receiving only the hollow echo of my own voice in response. Back at the intersection, Michael's expression shifted from annoyed to concerned when I reported Greg's absence. "Maybe he went back to the car for something," he suggested, though his tone lacked conviction. We waited another 10 minutes, growing increasingly uneasy. The dawn light slowly strengthened, revealing empty pathways in all directions. "I'll check the car," Michael said finally. "You stay here in case he comes back." I stood alone at the intersection, scanning the surrounding forest. Morning birdsong had begun to fill the air, but something about it seemed off, too scattered, lacking the harmonious quality typical of dawn choruses. I called Greg's name several times, listening intently after each call. Nothing. Michael returned, shaking his head. "Not at the car." "Could he have gone ahead to the trailhead without us?" I suggested, though it made little sense. Greg was experienced enough to know better than to separate from the group. We decided to check the main trailhead, leaving Jasmine and Kimberly at the intersection in case Greg returned. The trailhead was already becoming active with early hikers, but none matching Greg's description. After nearly 30 minutes of searching and growing concern, I decided to make one final check of the car and restrooms. I jogged back along the path, my mind spinning through increasingly worrying scenarios. Halfway to the intersection, a figure emerged from the trees to my left. I nearly collided with him before recognizing Greg. His appearance stopped me cold. His normally meticulously kept hair was disheveled, his face gleaming with sweat despite the cool morning air. Most disturbing was his expression, a combination of confusion and something else I couldn't quite identify. Fear, anger. His eyes seemed somehow different, though I couldn't articulate how. "Where have you been?" I demanded, relief quickly giving way to frustration. "We've been looking everywhere for you." Greg blinked, seeming to take a moment to register my presence. "I went to the bathroom," he said, his voice oddly flat. "When I came back to the intersection, you weren't there. I assumed you'd gone ahead to the trailhead." "That's impossible," I countered. Michael and I waited at the intersection for at least half an hour. We checked the car, the bathroom, the trailhead. You weren't anywhere. He shrugged dismissively. "Well, I don't know what to tell you. I went to the bathroom, came back, and you were gone." Something about his tone, the casual way he dismissed our concern, felt wrong. This wasn't the Greg I knew, a man usually quick to apologize and clarify misunderstandings. "Where's Michael?" he asked. "At the trailhead, looking for you." Greg nodded, then immediately asked again, "Where's Michael?" I stared at him. "I just told you. He's at the trailhead." As we crossed the footbridge leading to the trailhead, Greg suddenly pointed to a faint light visible through the trees along the riverbank. "Oh, maybe that's him," he said with unexpected animation. I followed his gaze, confused. The light was clearly too far off the trail to be Michael's, and the suggestion made no sense given what I had just told him. I chose not to respond, continuing toward the trailhead with growing discomfort. When we reunited with the others, their relief was palpable. Greg offered no real explanation for his disappearance, and though Michael pressed him briefly, the subject was eventually dropped in favor of beginning our delayed hike. As we finally set out on the trail, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed. Greg's behavior remained subtly off, his movements too stiff, his reaction slightly delayed, his attention frequently drifting to shadows between the trees that no one else seemed to notice. Even more disturbing was the realization forming in my mind. I wasn't entirely convinced that the person who returned to us was the same Greg who had disappeared. The mist trail began deceptively gently, winding through fragrant pine forest alongside the rushing Merced River. Under normal circumstances, I would have appreciated the growing light revealing the majestic landscape around us, but my attention remained fixed on Greg's peculiar behavior. He walked slightly apart from our group, sometimes lagging behind, other times surging ahead unpredictably. Occasionally, he would stop abruptly, head tilted as though listening to something inaudible to the rest of us. When questioned, he would startle slightly before offering a too casual explanation about admiring the scenery. Michael noticed it too. About an hour into our hike, as we approached Vernal Fall, he fell into step beside me. "Something's off with Greg," he murmured, keeping his voice low enough that the others couldn't hear. "Has he said anything to you?" I shook my head. "Nothing that makes sense. It's like he's distracted, or listening to something we can't hear." "Maybe he's just tired," Michael suggested, though his expression indicated he didn't believe it. The mist trail earned its name as we approached Vernal Fall, where the powerful cascade sent up clouds of spray that drenched the stone steps leading alongside it. Normally refreshing, today the mist felt unnaturally cold against my skin, almost oily in texture. As we climbed the slippery granite staircase beside the thundering waterfall, I noticed Greg staring intently into the mist, his expression oddly vacant. When I followed his gaze, I saw nothing but swirling vapor, yet he remained transfixed until Michael called his name 3 times, each progressively louder. "Sorry," Greg said, blinking rapidly. "I thought I saw someone on the other side." We all looked, but the opposite side of the falls was a sheer cliff face, impossible to traverse. "Must have been a shadow," Kimberly suggested, though her voice betrayed uncertainty. Our group fell silent as we continued climbing, the only sounds being our labored breathing and the roar of the waterfall. The usual camaraderie that marked our previous hikes was conspicuously absent, replaced by a tense vigilance that no one acknowledged but everyone felt. Beyond Vernal Fall, the trail opened to a beautiful valley with clear views of Nevada Fall ahead. We stopped for a brief rest, during which I noticed Michael conducting a subtle inventory of our supplies. "Has anyone seen my red flashlight?" he asked, frowning as he searched his pack. No one had. It was the first of several items that would inexplicably disappear throughout the day. Kimberly's glove, a water bottle, my trail map. Each disappearance was easily attributable to carelessness or being dropped along the trail. Yet the accumulation of these small losses created an unsettling pattern. The sun had fully risen, but it provided little warmth. Shadows seemed to linger unnaturally long in places where they should have been banished by the morning light. I found myself avoiding these darker patches without consciously deciding to do so. As we approached the junction where the mist trail meets the John Muir Trail, Greg suddenly veered off course, heading toward a dense thicket of trees. "Greg," Michael called sharply. "Where are you going?" Greg stopped, looking back with confusion. "I thought I saw a trail marker." "The trail is clearly here," Michael said. gesturing to the well-worn path we stood on. Greg rejoined us without further explanation, but I noticed him glancing back several times as we continued on. Whatever he thought he saw, it wasn't visible to the rest of us. The ascent grew steeper as we approached the sub-dome, the final section before the infamous cables. The terrain became increasingly barren, dominated by exposed granite that reflected the sunlight with uncomfortable intensity. Despite this, the air remained strangely cool, almost cold in places where shadow touched. We passed other hiking groups, exchanging brief greetings, but I noticed something unusual in these encounters. Other hikers seemed to give our group, particularly Greg, a wide berth, their eyes sliding away as though reluctant to make contact. One woman actively pulled her child closer as we passed, though she smiled tightly when I caught her eye. Were we projecting some subtle tension that others could sense? Or was there something more visible that I was missing? As we approached the base of Subdome, Greg stopped abruptly, staring up at the imposing granite formation with an expression I couldn't decipher. "It's watching us," he said softly. "What?" Michael asked, clearly unnerved. Greg blinked, then laughed unconvincingly. "The mountain. It's impressive how it dominates the landscape, isn't it? Like it's watching over everything." We continued upward, but his words lingered in my mind, taking on a significance beyond their literal meaning. The mountain did indeed seem to loom over us with an almost sentient presence, indifferent to our struggles yet acutely aware of our intrusion. The final approach to Half Dome's summit involves navigating the infamous cables, twin steel lines anchored to the granite that provide the only support for hikers traversing the perilously steep face. Under normal circumstances, this section inspires a healthy mix of exhilaration and terror. Today, something darker colored the experience. As we queued behind other hikers waiting for their turn at the cables, I noticed Greg staring not at the imposing ascent ahead, but at the vast expanse of forest spreading beneath us. His gaze tracked something I couldn't see, methodically sweeping back and forth as though following movement. "Beautiful view," I commented, trying to discern what had captured his attention. "They're following the trails," he replied without looking at me. "Who is?" He turned, seeming surprised by my question. "The hikers, of course. What else would I mean?" Before I could respond, it was our turn to begin the cable ascent. The physical demands of the climb temporarily pushed aside my unease. Gripping the steel cables, we pulled ourselves upward along the nearly 45-degree incline, our boots seeking purchase on the wooden slats spaced intermittently along the route. Halfway up, Jasmine froze, overcome by vertigo or fear, as Michael coached her through her panic. I glanced down at the line of hikers behind us. The perspective was dizzying, tiny figures clinging to the mountain face like insects on a wall. For a disorienting moment, the entire scene seemed to shift, as though the mountain itself had taken a subtle breath. I blinked hard, attributing the illusion to fatigue and altitude. When I looked again, everything appeared normal, though a persistent sense of wrongness lingered. We reached the summit shortly after noon, emerging onto the vast, flat expanse of Half Dome's peak. The achievement should have been triumphant, the panoramic views of Yosemite Valley a just reward for our efforts. Instead, a strange, subdued mood settled over our group as we found a spot to rest and eat. The summit was crowded with other hikers, their voices and laughter creating a reassuringly normal background to our quiet meal. I noticed Greg had positioned himself slightly apart, facing away from the magnificent vista that everyone else had come to admire. Again, his attention seemed fixed on the forest below, his expression unreadable. "Aren't you going to take any photos?" I asked, approaching him with water bottle extended as a peace offering. He accepted the water without looking at it. "Some things shouldn't be captured," he replied cryptically. A cloud passed overhead, casting a brief shadow across the summit. In that momentary dimming, I could have sworn the chattering voices around us faltered in perfect unison, resuming as the sunlight returned. No one else appeared to notice. As we prepared to begin our descent, I realized I hadn't seen Kimberly for several minutes. A quick scan of the summit didn't reveal her distinctive red jacket. Michael noted my concern. "She went behind those rocks to find some privacy," he explained, gesturing to a formation near the edge that provided some shelter from view. 10 minutes passed with no sign of her return. Jasmine volunteered to check on her, disappearing around the same rock formation, She returned moments later, confusion evident on her face. "She's not there," Jasmine reported. A brief search of the summit located Kimberly sitting calmly on the opposite side, staring out over the valley. When questioned about her movement, she seemed genuinely puzzled. "I've been here the whole time," she insisted. "I told Greg I was moving to this spot." All eyes turned to Greg, who shrugged. "I don't remember that." The incident passed without further comment, but I noticed Michael keeping closer watch on everyone afterward. The pleasant fatigue that should have accompanied our achievement was instead replaced by a growing tension that no one acknowledged directly. As we prepared to descend via the cables, I felt a sudden, overwhelming sensation of being observed, not by the other hikers around us, but by something else entirely. The feeling was so intense that I turned in a complete circle, scanning our surroundings. "What's wrong?" Michael asked, noticing my behavior. "Nothing," I replied automatically, though the sensation persisted. "Just taking one last look." The descent via the cables proved more physically demanding than the ascent, requiring careful backward steps and constant tension on tired muscles. About a third of the way down, Greg, positioned directly ahead of me, suddenly stopped. "Do you hear that?" he asked, his voice barely audible above the wind. Listened but detected nothing unusual, just the sound of exertion from other hikers and the distant rustle of wind through trees far below. "Someone's calling from the woods," he continued, his knuckles white on the cables. "We need to keep moving," Michael called from above. "People are waiting." Greg remained frozen for several more seconds before abruptly resuming his descent, moving with a mechanical precision that seemed at odds with the careful, measured movements required by the treacherous terrain. By the time we cleared the cables and reached the relative safety of Subdome, the late afternoon sun had begun its descent toward the western horizon. We needed to maintain a steady pace to reach the trailhead before dark. As we began the long trek down, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being paced by something moving parallel to the trail, just beyond the line of visibility. Occasionally, I caught glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, but whenever I turned to look directly, I saw only trees swaying in the breeze. The mountain's shadow stretched longer across the valley with each passing minute, as though reaching out to reclaim us. The descent from Half Dome should have been straightforward, the same path we had ascended, just in reverse. 4 to 5 hours of steady hiking would return us to the trailhead before full darkness set in. Yet from the moment we left the summit, subtle distortions began to accumulate. We reached the intersection of the John Muir Trail and the Mist Trail by late afternoon. The logical choice was to take the Mist Trail, steeper but shorter, the most direct route back. Michael consulted the map, confirming our position. "Mist Trail will get us down fastest," he concluded, folding the map and replacing it in his pack. Greg pointed to the John Muir Trail junction. "That's the Mist Trail," he said with absolute conviction. "No, it's not," Michael countered, frowning. "The Mist Trail is here." He gestured to the correct path. Greg stared at both trails, blinking rapidly. "Right," he finally said. "Of course." This momentary disorientation might have been dismissed as fatigue-induced confusion, but it marked the beginning of a pattern. Landmarks that should have been familiar from our ascent seemed subtly altered on the descent. Trees appeared to have shifted position. Rock formations looked different when approached from the opposite direction. The light was changing too, the golden late-afternoon sunlight taking on an unnatural quality as it filtered through the trees. Shadows stretched longer than they should have, darker in their centers, with edges that seemed to pulse slightly when viewed peripherally. About an hour into our descent, we passed Nevada Fall. The thundering cascade should have been on our left, yet somehow we approached it from an angle that placed it on our right. No one commented on this impossibility, though I saw confusion flicker across Jasmine's face as she glanced between the waterfall and the trail markers. The day's heat had begun to dissipate, replaced by a coolness that felt out of proportion to the normal evening temperature drop. I pulled on a light jacket, noticing that my breath was becoming visible in the increasingly chill air. "Does it seem colder than it should be?" I asked Michael quietly. He nodded, glancing at his watch. "Temperature drops fast in the valley once the sun starts to go down. We need to pick up the pace." But our pace was already steady, perhaps even faster than prudent for the increasingly treacherous downhill terrain. My legs burned with the strain of controlled descent, yet we seemed to be covering less ground than expected. Doesn't it seem like we should have reached Vernal Fall by now? Kimberly finally voiced what we all were thinking. Michael consulted his watch again. We have been on the trail longer than I expected, he admitted. But the descent always feels different than the climb. Greg had fallen behind slightly and I slowed to wait for him. When he caught up, I noticed his eyes constantly scanning the forest on either side of the trail. "You okay?" I asked. "We're walking in circles," he replied matter-of-factly. "What?" "The trail. It's looping back on itself." I looked ahead at the clearly defined path winding down the mountainside. "That's impossible. We're following the established trail." Greg's laugh lacked any trace of humor. "Just because we can see it doesn't mean it's going where it should." Before I could respond, he quickened his pace, moving ahead to join the others. His words lingered in my mind, gaining unwelcome credibility as our descent continued. Despite maintaining a consistent downhill trajectory, landmarks I expected to see failed to materialize while unfamiliar sections of trail appeared before us. The forest grew denser as we continued downward, the trees closing in on either side of the path. Sound became muffled in a way that couldn't be explained by the vegetative buffer alone, as though the air itself had thickened, dampening acoustic vibrations before they could fully form. "We should have passed that distinctive boulder formation by now," Michael muttered after another hour of hiking. He pulled out his map again, studying it with increasing frustration. "According to this, we should be approaching the footbridge before Vernal Fall." I glanced around at our surroundings, dense forest with no sign of a waterfall or bridge. Could we have taken a wrong turn? "There are no wrong turns," he insisted. "The trail is clearly marked the entire way." As if to contradict him, we rounded a bend to find ourselves facing an unexpected fork in the path. Neither direction was marked with the usual trail signs. "This isn't right," Jasmine said, voicing our collective confusion. "This fork wasn't here on the way up." Greg stepped forward, pointing to the left-hand path without hesitation. "This way." "How can you be sure?" Michael challenged. "I just am." Something in his tone made further argument seem pointless. We followed the left path, which initially appeared to descend in the correct general direction. After about 10 minutes, however, the trail began to level out, then subtly incline upward. The opposite of the descent we should have been making. "This is wrong," Michael said, stopping abruptly. "We're heading back up." Greg turned, his expression unreadable in the fading light. "No, we're not. The trail just dips and rises. It will descend again soon." Before Michael could respond, a distant sound reached us, faint but unmistakable. Voices, other hikers on the trail ahead, their conversation indistinct but their presence reassuring. "See?" Greg said, gesturing forward. "Others are ahead. The trail must be correct." We continued forward, listening as the voices gradually became more distinct. Except they didn't. Despite apparently drawing closer to their source, the voices remained tantalizingly just beyond the range of comprehension, present enough to confirm human origin, too distant to discern words. The light was failing rapidly now, the forest canopy accelerating the onset of darkness. Michael called a halt and we all retrieved our flashlights. Mine flickered weakly despite fresh batteries installed that morning. Others experienced similar issues, their lights casting sickly, insufficient pools of illumination that seemed to struggle against the encroaching darkness. "This isn't right," Michael said again, his voice tight with suppressed concern. "We should have reached the valley floor by now." No one disagreed, yet we had no choice but to continue forward, each step taking us deeper into an increasingly unfamiliar landscape. The trail itself remained clear, but its surroundings had transformed into something none of us recognized from our ascent. The voices ahead continued to call, always just beyond the next bend, their eerie persistence both beckoning and warning. Complete darkness descended with unnatural swiftness. One moment we could still discern shapes and shadows. The next, an impenetrable blackness enveloped us, broken only by our struggling flashlight beams. The darkness felt almost tangible, pressing against us with malevolent intent. "We need to stay together," Michael instructed, his voice tight with controlled fear. "Keep the person ahead of you in sight at all times." We formed a line, Michael leading, followed by Jasmine, Kimberly, myself, and Greg bringing up the rear. Our pace slowed to a cautious shuffle, each step carefully placed on an increasingly treacherous path. The trail had narrowed, hemmed in by dense vegetation that seemed to shift and reach toward us when illuminated by our flashlights. The distant voices that had drawn us forward gradually faded, replaced by the ambient sounds of the forest at night, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of nocturnal creatures, the whisper of wind through leaves. Yet these familiar sounds carried unfamiliar qualities, occurring at irregular intervals and emanating from directions that seemed to change without logic. "Does anyone recognize where we are?" Jasmine finally asked, her voice small against the vast darkness. No one answered immediately. The truth was too disquieting to voice aloud. We were on a trail that shouldn't exist, in a section of forest that bore no resemblance to the well-documented path between Half Dome and the valley floor. "We're still on the main trail," Michael insisted, though his tone lacked conviction. "It's just difficult to recognize in the dark." I felt someone close behind me, their breath on my neck. I turned, expecting to see Greg, but he was several paces back, his flashlight beam pointed at the ground. "Did you just move up behind me?" I asked, trying to keep the tremor from my voice. He looked up, confusion evident even in the poor light. "No, I've maintained the same distance." I turned back to face forward, accelerating slightly to close the gap between myself and Kimberly. The sensation of being closely followed persisted, though I resisted the urge to look back again. Our progress slowed further as the trail began to twist unpredictably, sometimes doubling back on itself in a way that defied topographical logic. Michael frequently consulted his compass, his frustration growing as the readings contradicted our perceived direction of travel. "This makes no sense," he muttered after one particularly bewildering turn. "According to this, we're heading north, but we should be moving west, descending toward the valley." "The mountains interfering with the magnetic field," Greg suggested, his voice oddly calm compared to the rising panic evident in the others. "That's not how compasses work," Michael snapped. "Isn't it?" Greg replied. Something in his tone made me shiver despite the exertion of hiking. Time became increasingly difficult to track. My watch indicated we had been descending for over 4 hours, yet the trail showed no signs of approaching the valley floor. Fatigue set in, muscles protesting the continued strain, mind struggling against the disorientation of prolonged darkness and unfamiliar terrain. "We need to rest," Kimberly announced, her voice strained. "Just for a few minutes." Michael reluctantly agreed, and we found a small clearing just off the trail. Sitting in a tight circle, we shared what remained of our water and energy bars. No one spoke much, each lost in private thoughts or too exhausted for conversation. I noticed Greg sitting slightly apart, his flashlight extinguished, staring into the darkness as though he could perceive what was hidden from the rest of us. When I directed my light toward him, he flinched, raising a hand to shield his eyes. "Sorry," I murmured, lowering the beam. "They don't like the light," he replied cryptically. Before I could ask who they were, a sound echoed through the forest, a long, keening wail that resembled no animal I'd ever heard. It started low, rising in pitch until it became almost painfully high, then abruptly ceased. We froze, straining to locate the source. "Mountain lion?" Jasmine suggested, her voice barely audible. Michael shook his head. "Doesn't sound like any mountain lion I've ever heard." The wail came again, closer this time, seemingly from multiple directions simultaneously. It was answered by another, then another, until the forest resonated with an impossible chorus. "We need to move," Michael decided, scrambling to his feet. "Now," no one argued. We hastily gathered our belongings and returned to the trail, our earlier fatigue forgotten in the surge of adrenaline. The sounds pursued us, maintaining a consistent distance regardless of our pace, never quite catching up, never fully receding. The trail began to slope more steeply downward, offering the first encouraging sign in hours that we were indeed descending toward the valley. Our pace quickened, hope lending new energy to tired limbs. Then, as suddenly as it had steepened, the trail leveled out, opening into a large clearing that none of us recognized. In the center stood a massive oak tree, its gnarled branches spreading outward like beseeching arms. its trunk wider than any oak should grow at this elevation. "This isn't right," Michael said for what felt like the 100th time that night. "This clearing, this tree, they shouldn't be here." Greg stepped forward, approaching the tree with an expression of recognition. "We've been here before," he said softly. "That's impossible," I replied. "We would remember a tree like this." He turned to face me, his features strangely animated in the harsh light of my flashlight. "Not tonight, before, long before." A sudden gust of wind swept through the clearing, carrying with it a scent I recognized from our campsite the previous night, that faintly metallic odor underlying the natural forest smells. The same wind seemed to whisper through the oak's branches, creating a sound disturbingly similar to the keening wails that had pursued us. Michael consulted his compass again, then pointed to a narrow path leading away from the oak. "This way. It's heading west." As we followed this new trail, I glanced back at the oak tree. For an instant, I thought I saw figures moving around its base, thin, elongated shapes that melted into the darkness when I tried to focus on them directly. "Did you see that?" I whispered to Kimberly. "See what?" she asked, but her tone suggested she already knew what I meant, and had seen it too. The trail narrowed again, descending so steeply that we were forced to brace ourselves against trees to prevent falling. The vegetation changed subtly, transitioning from mixed conifers to more deciduous species, a shift that suggested we were indeed approaching lower elevations. After what seemed like hours but may have been only minutes, the trees suddenly thinned, and we found ourselves on a familiar stretch of trail, unmistakably the lower section of the mist trail, perhaps half a mile from the trailhead. The relief was palpable. Even our flashlights seemed to brighten, their beams cutting more effectively through the now ordinary darkness. "We made it," Jasmine breathed, the first to voice our collective relief. Michael nodded, though his expression remained guarded. "Let's keep moving. I want to reach the car before we celebrate." As we resumed our hike on now familiar terrain, I found myself repeatedly looking back, half expecting to see something emerging from the forest behind us. Nothing materialized, yet the sensation of being followed, of being watched, persisted until we finally reached the trailhead. The parking lot appeared exactly as we had left it that morning, our car waiting alongside a handful of others, the restroom building standing silent in the darkness. Everything normal, everything as it should be. Yet as we loaded our gear into the trunk, I caught Greg staring back at the trailhead, his expression unreadable. "What is it?" I asked. "It let us go," he replied softly. "This time." The drive back to our campsite passed in exhausted silence. Despite having successfully completed the hike, no one felt the usual sense of accomplishment. Instead, a shared understanding hung unspoken between us. Something inexplicable had occurred on that mountain, something beyond rational explanation. We arrived at our campsite well after midnight. Too tired to cook, we consumed the remaining energy bars and trail mix before retreating to our respective sleeping arrangements. I hesitated before climbing into my hammock, the memory of the previous night's disturbances still fresh. "Maybe I should sleep in the car," I suggested half-jokingly. Michael shook his head. "We're all staying together tonight. I'll leave the rainfly off my tent so I can see out." Despite my exhaustion, sleep proved elusive. Each forest sound triggered heightened alertness, each shift in the breeze felt significant. When I finally drifted off, my dreams were fragmented and disturbing. Images of endless trails that doubled back on themselves, of shadows that moved independently of their casters, of voices calling from places no human could reach. I woke before dawn, drenched in sweat despite the cool night air. The forest around our campsite appeared perfectly normal in the pre-dawn light. No sign of the unnatural stillness that had marked the previous morning. Birds sang their usual chorus. Small creatures rustled in the underbrush. Everything as it should be. Yet I couldn't shake the sensation that something fundamental had changed, not in our surroundings, but in our perception of them. Like a photograph with subtle details altered, the world appeared the same at first glance but revealed disturbing inconsistencies upon closer inspection. We broke camp efficiently, eager to leave despite having originally planned to stay another night. No one suggested extending our trip. By unspoken agreement, We were going home. As we loaded the last of our gear into the car, Greg paused, staring into the forest with that same distant expression he had worn throughout much of our hike. "What do you see?" I finally asked, unable to contain my curiosity. He turned to me, his eyes clearer than they had been since his disappearance the previous morning. "Nothing," he replied. "Not anymore." The drive home felt unnaturally long, the landscape outside the windows somehow less substantial than it had been on our journey to Yosemite. We stopped only once for fuel and food, conversation limited to practicalities. Michael dropped me off first, helping unload my gear with mechanical efficiency. As I shouldered my backpack, he hesitated, clearly struggling with something he wanted to say. "What happened out there?" he began, then faltered. "I don't know," I admitted. "I don't think any of us do." He nodded, relief evident in his expression. Relief that he wasn't alone in his confusion, that his perception hadn't been uniquely compromised. "Let's talk in a few days," he suggested, "after we've had some time to process." I agreed, though privately I wondered what there was to process. We had experienced something that defied rational explanation, something that would likely make less sense with reflection rather than more. That evening, as I was unpacking my gear, my phone rang. Michael's name flashed on the screen. "Have you spoken to anyone about yesterday?" he asked without preamble. "No, why?" He exhaled heavily. "My wife knew we were camping. She said she had a dream where she saw me in a tent in a forest, with someone standing outside." The chill that ran through me had nothing to do with the air conditioning in my apartment. "She woke up around 3 in the morning," Michael continued, "with an overwhelming urge to pray for me. And she did. 3 in the morning, precisely when I had awakened to the sound of footsteps circling our camp." "What does it mean?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted an answer. "I don't know," Michael replied. "But Greg called me after I dropped him off. He doesn't remember anything about disappearing at the trailhead. Says he went to the bathroom and came right back." "That's impossible. He was gone for over half an hour." "I know. And there's something else." Michael paused. "He claims he never said any of those strange things on the trail. About the mountain watching us, about the trail looping back on itself. He has no memory of any of it." I sat heavily on the edge of my bed trying to process this information. If Greg had no memory of his own bizarre behavior, then either he was lying for reasons I couldn't fathom, or something had influenced his actions and perceptions without his awareness. Neither possibility was comforting. "Do you think we should report this?" I asked. "To the park rangers, maybe?" Michael's laugh held no humor. "And tell them what? That we got lost on one of the most well-marked trails in the national park system? That we heard voices and saw shadows? That my friend acted strangely and doesn't remember it?" He was right, of course. We had no evidence beyond our subjective experiences, nothing that would convince authorities that anything unusual had occurred. So we just... "What? Pretend it didn't happen?" I asked. "I don't think we can," Michael replied softly. "I don't think it will let us." After ending the call, I sat in silence for a long time, replaying the events of the past 2 days in my mind. Each recollection seemed to shift slightly, details changing in subtle ways that made me question my own memory. Was the trail really as disorienting as I remembered? Were the voices we heard actually just the wind? Was Greg's behavior truly as bizarre as it had seemed at the time? Yet beneath these natural doubts lay a deeper certainty. Something had happened on that mountain, something beyond normal explanation. The forest had changed around us, the trails had shifted. Time and distance had distorted in ways that defied physical laws. In the weeks that followed, I researched missing persons cases in Yosemite, finding dozens of instances where hikers vanished without explanation, many on well-traveled trails in good weather. Some were eventually found, unable to explain how they had become lost in familiar territory. Others remained missing, their disappearances adding to the park's mysterious legacy. I never returned to Half Dome, though the mountain frequently appeared in my dreams, always looming, always watching, always waiting. In these dreams, I would find myself on endless trails that circled back on themselves, pursued by something I could never quite see but always sensed just behind me. Michael and I spoke occasionally about our experience, our recollections growing hazier with time yet never completely fading. Greg, however, refused to discuss the trip at all, changing the subject whenever it arose. Something in his eyes suggested he remembered more than he admitted, or perhaps feared remembering. Sometimes, when hiking other trails closer to home, I find myself scanning the forest edge, listening for footsteps that don't match my own. The sensation of being observed has never fully dissipated, as though whatever noticed us in Yosemite continues to track our movements from afar. I've come to believe that certain places in this world exist at the intersection of realities, locations where the familiar and the unknown bleed into one another under specific conditions. Yosemite, with its ancient forests and towering monoliths, may be one such place. What watched us from the forest that night? What distorted our path and time itself? What briefly claimed Greg before returning him suddenly changed? I have no answers, only the lingering certainty that for a brief period, we glimpsed something beyond the world we thought we knew, and it glimpsed us in return. Perhaps most disturbing is the thought that occurs to me in the darkest hours of night. What if it followed us home? What if even now it waits just beyond the threshold of perception, observing from shadows we've been conditioned to ignore? Some nights I still wake suddenly at 3:30 a.m., heart racing for no apparent reason, listening for footsteps that never quite materialize. And in those moments between sleeping and waking, I could swear I hear distant voices calling from the woods behind my apartment, voices that sound almost, but not quite, human. I live in the suburbs of Budapest, Hungary, in a small town about 15 minutes from the city. They call it a town, but really it's just an overgrown village with narrow streets and closely packed houses. The atmosphere here is distinctly provincial. Everyone knows everyone, rumors spread faster than wildfire, and strangers are noticed immediately. Lighting at night is scarce, but our street is reasonably well lit. This detail would become crucial to my experience. In spring of 2019, our apartment needed renovation. The walls of my bedroom had developed moisture problems, with dark patches appearing at an alarming rate. The landlord finally agreed to have it repainted and treated for mold. This meant I had to temporarily relocate to our guest bedroom while the work was being done. The guest bedroom was considerably smaller than my regular room, almost claustrophobic. It contained only a single bed, a small desk with a chair and a narrow wardrobe. What made this room different was its large window facing the street, providing a clear view of the neighbors' houses opposite. Our apartment occupied the first floor of a 2-story building with a spacious garden behind it. My regular bedroom overlooked this garden, but the guest room faced the front, exposing me to the street life I rarely paid attention to. The first night was uncomfortable. The bed felt too firm. The street lamps cast strange shadows across the ceiling, and occasional car headlights swept across the walls. I tossed and turned, unable to find comfort in this unfamiliar space. Around 2 a.m, I finally drifted into uneasy sleep. I remember thinking how temporary this arrangement would be. Just a week, the workers had promised. How naive I was. How utterly unprepared for what would transpire in this tiny room, with its large window like an unblinking eye staring out at the darkened street below. On the third night in the guest bedroom, my chronic insomnia struck with particular intensity. The digital clock on the nightstand showed 2:37 a.m., and I had been staring at the ceiling for hours. The house had gone quiet long ago. Even the usual ambient sounds of the building had faded to nothing, leaving me in a bubble of silence. Then I heard it. A strange, rhythmic sound from outside. A steady, heavy thudding. At first I assumed it was music from one of the neighbors, though it seemed odd for someone to be playing anything so loud at this hour. But this sound followed no recognizable pattern or melody. It was mechanical, methodical, like footsteps but heavier and more deliberate than any human's walk could be. And it was getting louder. Curiosity overcame caution. I slipped out of bed and moved to the window, standing just at the edge where the streetlight cast its orange glow. The street appeared empty at first, but then a movement caught my eye. A figure was walking down the center of the street. Even from a distance, something about its proportions seemed wrong. As it came closer, illuminated by the street lamps, I realized why. This figure was impossibly tall. I live on the first floor, yet I had to crane my neck to see its head. It must have been at least 6 meters tall, The figure appeared humanoid, but with disturbing differences. Its skin was a uniform gray, smooth, and without texture. Its head had no discernible facial features, no eyes, nose, or mouth that I could detect. Most alarming were its arms, 4 of them. 2 hung normally from its shoulders, while another pair protruded from around its midsection. Despite its lack of eyes, the being moved with purpose, occasionally stopping to turn toward houses as if examining them. Its movements were fluid, almost graceful despite its monstrous size. It wasn't shuffling or lumbering like creatures in horror films. It moved with deliberate precision. I remained frozen, my heart pounding so loudly I worried it might hear me. Then, as if sensing my observation, the creature turned toward my window. I quickly retreated into the shadows, pressing myself against the wall. The being approached our building. Through a tiny gap in the curtains, I watched as it stood directly outside. Its featureless face seemingly focused on our apartment. It remained motionless for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. I didn't dare move a muscle. Finally, it turned and continued its journey down the street, the sound of its footsteps gradually fading into the distance. I spent the remainder of the night huddled in the corner furthest from the window, questioning my sanity and trying to rationalize what I had seen. Sleep was impossible. The following morning, exhaustion clouded my thinking. I had barely slept, and the events of the night seemed dreamlike in the harsh light of day. Had I actually seen that thing, or had my tired mind conjured it up? The logical part of me insisted it must have been a hallucination brought on by insomnia, stress, and an unfamiliar sleeping environment. I went through my day in a fog, my thoughts repeatedly drifting back to that featureless face and those 4 arms. By afternoon, I had almost convinced myself it had been a vivid nightmare, until I noticed something strange in the street. Outside our building and several houses down, there were unusual indentations in the asphalt, widely spaced, circular depressions as if something incredibly heavy had walked precisely where I'd seen the figure. That evening, I prepared myself. I positioned my desk chair near the window, but out of direct sight from the street. On the desk, I placed my phone with the camera app open and my laptop to take notes. If the thing appeared again, I would document it. As midnight passed, the street grew quiet. One by one, lights went out in neighboring houses. By 2 a.m., the entire street was dark except for the street lamps. I fought to stay awake, pinching myself and sipping cold water. At 2:34 a.m., I heard it again, that same methodical thudding. My pulse quickened as I readied my phone. The sound grew louder, and then I saw it again, moving with the same purposeful gait down the center of the street. In the orange glow of the street lamps, the being looked even more bizarre than I remembered. Its gray skin seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, giving it a matte appearance. As it walked, its 4 arms swung slightly out of synchronization with each other, creating an unsettling rhythm. With trembling hands, I raised my phone and attempted to take a photo. The screen showed only darkness and a blur of motion. I tried again, this time with the flash on, but the results were just as useless, streaks of light against darkness with no discernible figure. The creature suddenly stopped. Its featureless face turned toward my window, as if the flash had alerted it to my presence. I ducked down, heart hammering in my chest. When I dared to look again, it was standing directly in front of our building, its height allowing it to peer directly into my first-floor window. I watched, paralyzed, as one of its upper arms raised slowly and pressed against the glass. The window vibrated slightly under the pressure. The being's head tilted as if in curiosity, though how it could see without eyes remained a terrifying mystery. After what seemed an eternity, it withdrew its hand and continued down the street. Once it was out of sight, I collapsed onto the floor, gasping for breath. Checking my phone, I found that none of the photos showed anything conclusive, just blurry shapes that could be dismissed as camera errors. But I knew what I had seen, and now it had noticed me. After 2 encounters, I could no longer dismiss the experience as hallucination. The next day, fatigue dragged at me, but determination pushed me forward. I needed answers, explanations, anything to make sense of what was happening. My first step was research. I spent hours online, searching for any similar sightings in Budapest or surrounding areas. I found nothing about tall gray figures, but did discover multiple forum threads discussing strange nocturnal sounds in our region, particularly in the older suburbs. Most people describe them as mechanical or industrial noises with no clear source. One post caught my attention. A woman living 3 kilometers away described waking to the sound of giant footsteps in March 2018, almost exactly a year before my experience. She had been too frightened to look outside but mentioned that neighborhood dogs had gone berserk that night. In the afternoon, I cautiously approached my elderly neighbor, Mrs. Kovac, who had lived in the building for over 40 years. I framed my questions carefully, asking if she had ever noticed anything unusual at night, particularly strange sounds. Her reaction was unexpected. She went pale and invited me inside, checking the hallway before closing her door. In hushed tones, she told me that every few years, usually in early spring, she would hear heavy footsteps outside. Her late husband had once looked out the window and had refused to ever speak about what he saw. He would only say that some things were not meant to be witnessed. The old people in this town know to stay away from windows on certain nights, she told me. It's been happening for generations. When I pressed for details about what it was, she shook her head. Those who see it and speak of it invite attention they don't want. Be careful, young one. I left her apartment with more questions than answers and a growing sense of dread. That evening, I visited the local library to research the town's history. The older archives revealed something interesting. Dating back to the 1800s, there were periodic reports of missing persons in the area, always in spring, always at night. The cases were never solved. More disturbing was a collection of local folklore I found in a dusty, rarely accessed section. It contained stories about the night watchman, described as a silent guardian who walked the streets after midnight, taking those who had somehow transgressed against the natural order. The descriptions were vague but mentioned its imposing height and ability to look into second-story windows. By nightfall, I was torn between intellectually dismissing these stories as superstition and the visceral certainty that they connected to what I had seen. I returned to the apartment just as darkness fell, my mind racing with possibilities, none of them comforting. A week passed, during which I observed the figure 3 more times. Each night it appeared it would pause longer at our building. Each morning after a sighting, I would find myself more exhausted, my nerves increasingly frayed. The lack of sleep began taking a serious toll. Dark circles formed under my eyes. My hands developed a persistent tremor. Concentrating on everyday tasks became nearly impossible. At work, colleagues commented on my appearance, asking if I was ill. I brushed off their concerns with mumbled excuses about insomnia. The workers renovating my bedroom had encountered unexpected issues with the walls. Something about the structure being compromised, extending my stay in the guest room indefinitely. This news hit me like a physical blow. I couldn't face another night in that room with its window to the street, but I had nowhere else to go. I began experiencing waking nightmares and microsleeps where the boundary between dreaming and reality blurred. Sometimes during the day, I would catch glimpses of gray skin and elongated limbs in my peripheral vision. When I turned to look, nothing would be there. My appetite vanished. Food turned to ash in my mouth. I lost 5 kilograms in 10 days. The physical deterioration was matched by mental decline. Paranoia crept in at the edges of my consciousness. I began to suspect that neighbors were watching me, that they knew something about the creature that they weren't telling. Perhaps they were complicit somehow. I started setting up elaborate systems to monitor the street. I purchased a motion-activated camera and positioned it to record through the window. I hung bells on strings across the window frame to alert me to any movement. I created a detailed log of sightings, noting times, duration, and the entity's behavior. The camera never captured anything definitive, just shadows and distortions that could be explained away as technical glitches. Yet each night between 2:30 and 3 a.m., the bells would chime softly as something massive passed by. During one particularly bad episode, I became convinced that the being could somehow enter the building. I barricaded my door with furniture and lined the window with salt, a protective measure I'd read about in one of the folklore books. Rationally, I knew these actions were pointless, but rationality was slipping away from me. On the 15th night in the guest bedroom, something changed. The creature appeared as usual, but instead of merely observing my window, it pressed its featureless face directly against the glass. Through the thin curtain, I could see the outline of its head, smooth, ovoid, devoid of features, yet somehow radiating awareness. It remained there for nearly 10 minutes, perfectly still, as if listening. Then it spoke, not aloud, but somehow directly into my mind. The voice was neither male nor female, neither young nor old. It simply was. Soon, it said, just that single word. Then it withdrew and continued its patrol. I spent the rest of the night huddled in the bathtub as far from windows as I could get, alternating between silent tears and manic laughter. By morning, I knew I had to confront whatever this thing was or lose my mind completely. After 17 sleepless nights, I reached breaking point. I couldn't continue this way, afraid to sleep, afraid to look out the window, yet compelled to watch for the entity every night. I had two choices: flee the town entirely or confront the situation. Pride and stubborn curiosity led me to choose the latter. I spent the day preparing. First, I visited a doctor who reluctantly prescribed sleeping medication after seeing my clearly deteriorated state. Next, I purchased a high-powered flashlight, thinking that perhaps fully illuminating the creature might reveal its true nature. Finally, I bought a small digital recorder to capture any sounds it might make. That evening, I took half the prescribed sleeping pill, enough to take the edge off my anxiety but not enough to render me unconscious. I positioned myself by the window with the curtains open, flashlight and recorder ready. If the entity appeared, I would not hide this time. Hours passed. Midnight came and went. 1 a.m., 2 a.m. My eyelids grew heavy despite my determination. By 2:30, the usual time of the creature's appearance, I had to pinch myself repeatedly to stay awake. 45 a.m., nothing. Going a.m. The street remained empty. By 4 a.m., I began to wonder if my plan to confront it had somehow deterred the entity. Perhaps it only appeared to those who feared it. This thought gave me a glimmer of hope, and I eventually drifted into the first real sleep I'd had in weeks. I woke just after noon, feeling marginally refreshed. The entity's absence encouraged me. That night I repeated my vigil, again with the curtains open, making my presence obvious. Again, the creature did not appear. For 3 consecutive nights I maintained this pattern, and for 3 nights the street remained empty of unusual visitors. I began to believe that by facing my fear I had somehow banished the entity. Sleep returned, and with it my rational mind began to reassert itself. On the 4th night, exhausted from catching up on work I'd neglected during my ordeal, I fell asleep early without my usual preparations. No medication, no flashlight ready, curtains drawn. I woke suddenly at 3:17 a.m., the room significantly colder than when I'd fallen asleep. Something had changed in the atmosphere, a heaviness, a sense of pressure, as if the air itself had thickened. And there was a sound, not the familiar thudding of footsteps, but a soft, rhythmic whisper like breathing against glass. Slowly, I turned toward the window. The curtains were now partially open, though I distinctly remembered closing them. Through the gap, I could see a portion of the street outside, illuminated by the orange glow of the street lamps. Something blocked that light, a massive silhouette pressed against the glass. It had been waiting for me to lower my guard. With trembling hands, I reached for the flashlight on my nightstand. My fingers closed around it just as a voice echoed in my mind. "I see you." Summoning every ounce of courage, I switched on the flashlight and directed its beam at the window. The powerful light illuminated what stood outside, and the revelation stole my breath away. The window was empty. No creature, no entity, but reflected in the glass was my own face, gaunt, pale, eyes sunken from weeks of sleep deprivation. Behind that reflection, visible in the mirror on my wardrobe door, stood the gray figure inside my room. I spun around, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The room was empty except for me, but in the mirror the entity remained, watching me with its featureless face. Reality fractured around me. Was I seeing something supernatural, or had my mind finally broken under the strain? The following morning found me in the psychiatric ward of Budapest Central Hospital. Apparently neighbors had called emergency services after hearing my screams and seeing me running down the street in my nightclothes at 3:30 a.m., shouting about something following me. The doctors diagnosed me with severe parasomnia complicated by stress and sleep deprivation. They explained that prolonged insomnia can cause hallucinations indistinguishable from reality. The brain, desperate for REM sleep, begins to dream while awake, projecting nightmares onto the conscious world. My description of the entity aligned with typical hypnagogic hallucinations, exaggerated proportions, featureless faces, and a sense of malevolent presence. The footsteps I'd heard were likely my own heartbeat, amplified by anxiety and the acoustics of a quiet night. They kept me under observation for 3 days, administering medications that helped me sleep dreamlessly. As my sleep pattern normalized, my perspective cleared. The doctor's explanations made sense, far more sense than a giant four-armed entity stalking suburban Budapest. Upon my release, I returned to the apartment with newfound rationality. The renovation of my bedroom had been completed during my hospital stay, allowing me to move back into my familiar space. The guest room with its street-facing window was closed up. I never entered it again. Life gradually returned to normal. I maintained a strict sleep schedule and continued taking mild medication to help me rest. The nightmares receded, and with them, my belief in the nocturnal visitor. 2 weeks after my hospitalization, I met Mrs. Kovacs in the hallway. She asked carefully about my health, and I explained the doctor's diagnosis, expecting her to be relieved that there was a medical explanation for my behavior. Instead, she looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite interpret, something between pity and fear. "Sometimes," she said quietly, "it's better to believe the doctors, safer." Before I could question her meaning, she returned to her apartment, locking the door behind her. That evening, curiosity drove me to check the local news archives once more. What I found disturbed me deeply. 3 people had gone missing from nearby neighborhoods during the period of my episodes. All disappearances occurred on nights when I had seen the entity. Coincidence? I told myself. It had to be coincidence. Then I discovered something that shattered my newfound rationality. While reorganizing my belongings, I found the digital recorder I had prepared for my confrontation with the entity. I had forgotten about it entirely during my breakdown. With trembling fingers, I played back the recording. Most of it contained only the ambient sounds of night, distant traffic, the occasional dog barking, my own breathing. But at precisely 3:17 a.m., there was a voice, not mine, not in my mind, but captured clearly by the device's microphone. "I see you. That was 2 years ago. I no longer live in Budapest or anywhere near it." After hearing the recording, I packed essential belongings and left within hours, breaking my lease and abandoning most of my possessions. I relocated to a bustling downtown apartment in Vienna, deliberately choosing a place surrounded by activity and light, with no access to quiet streets. I've never again experienced the nocturnal visitations. The doctors would say this confirms their diagnosis. Changing my environment removed the stressors triggering my parasomnia. Most days I believed them. I've rebuilt my life, found new work, and established new routines centered around healthy sleep habits. But I keep the digital recorder locked in a safe deposit box at a local bank. I haven't listened to it since that day, afraid that repeated exposure might somehow reawaken whatever connection I had established. Yet I can't bring myself to destroy it either. It remains the only tangible evidence that what I experienced might have been real. Sometimes, usually in early spring when the nights are still long, I wake suddenly around 3 a.m. with the unshakable feeling that something is watching me. On these nights, I never approach the windows. Instead, I turn on all the lights and wait for dawn. I've researched similar experiences extensively, finding scattered reports across Eastern Europe describing entities matching what I saw. Most witnesses are eventually diagnosed with mental health issues or sleep disorders. Those who resist medical intervention often disappear or suffer nervous breakdowns. Was what I saw real? Was it a manifestation of a deteriorating mind? Or is there some middle ground? Perhaps certain states of consciousness allow us to perceive things that normally exist just beyond our awareness. I don't have answers, but I've learned to live with the uncertainty. I maintain my medication regimen and see a therapist regularly. I avoid reading about unexplained disappearances. I never sleep in rooms with street-facing windows. And each year, as March approaches, I take an extended vacation somewhere far from Eastern Europe. Somewhere crowded and brightly lit, where the sound of footsteps is always human and never solitary in the dead of night. Because somewhere deep inside, past all the rational explanations and medical terminology, I know what I saw, and I know it saw me too. Perhaps that's the most terrifying revelation. Not that monsters might exist, but that once they notice you, you never fully escape their attention. You just learn to live with the knowledge that somewhere, something remembers your face and knows exactly where to find you. It's simply waiting for the right moment to visit again.